Good evening, listeners. Welcome to Noir Intellect. I'm your host, Victor Blackwood. If you enjoy mysteries, hidden clues, and uncovering the truth, don't forget to like and subscribe. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Leave it in the comments below. Now, keep your eyes open and your mind sharp. The mystery begins now. Chapter 1. A house that changed hands too easily. I was crossing 35th Street a little after 6 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, with the sound of crosstown traffic in my ears, and a respectable appetite getting itself in order for Fritz's dinner, when I saw Lieutenant Rowcliffe come out of a taxi with a face that looked as if he had been insulted by the weather. Since I had never known Rowcliffe to look pleased, except when he was being unpleasant to somebody, that alone would not have stopped me. What did stop me was the man behind him, Jasper Reed. At least I thought it was Jasper Reed. He had the same tan overcoat, the same springy gait, and the same neat derby tilted half an inch too far back for dignity and half an inch too little for style. Then he turned, and I saw it was not Reed at all, only some other citizen with the same bad habits in hats. That was the first time Jasper Reed disappointed me that day. The second came less than an hour later, and he was beyond apology then, when I let myself into the old brownstone and shut the door behind me. The house had its usual look and smell, which no other house in New York ever quite managed. The look came from years of orderly stubbornness, inherited from Wolfe and enforced by Fritz and me. The smell was a blend of old wood, polished leather, books, and, drifting faintly down from the plant rooms above, the warm, damp breath of the orchids. If you think orchids do not have a smell unless you press your nose into them, you have never lived in a house where 10,000 of them are treated like titled guests. I put my hat on the rack, shed my coat, and stepped into the office. Nero Wolfe was in his chair behind the desk, all 1/7 of a ton of him, reading a book which he held as gently as a priest might hold a relic. The globe lamp cast a mellow pool on the desk blotter. The red leather chair opposite waited for clients, liars, and occasional victims. The room itself, with its shelves and cabinets and deep colors, always seemed to me like the only place in Manhattan where haste had to ask permission before entering. Wolfe looked up when I came in. His eyes, which could be lazy as a cat's and hard as steel without moving an inch, rested on me. "You are late," he said, "by 4 minutes. If that ruins dinner, sue the city." "It ruins nothing. Have you brought beer?" "No, I brought news. You can decide whether it is worth more than beer. That is unlikely." I sat, stretched my legs, and lighted a cigarette. "Jasper Reed is dead." Wolfe shut the book on a finger to keep the place. Who was Jasper Reed? A real estate broker with a talent for making neglected property sound romantic. Middle height, tidy mustache, shoes too shiny, and a line of talk smooth enough to sell sewer grates as garden ornaments. We met him last winter when Mrs. Valden wanted that warehouse matter checked. He was useful, or tried to be, Wolfe grunted. Dead how? Murdered, unless he dropped in his tracks from a theatrical impulse. Found in an empty house on Mercer Street. A narrow, old job, 3 stories. Brick front blackened by time, with shutters that look as if they gave up in the Harding administration. Reed had the listing once, maybe more than once. The place has changed hands 4 times in 2 years, and nobody seems to know who has occupied it, if anybody has. Wolfe laid the book aside. That meant the news had managed to climb above beer in his scale of values. Who found the body? A janitor from the machine shop next door. He had seen a side gate standing open. He went in to shut it, or something, depending on his private code, and found Reed in the dining room on the ground floor, on his back beneath the ceiling fixture. No blood worth bragging about. Maybe strangled, maybe poisoned. The doctors will enjoy deciding it. The windows were painted shut from the inside. Dust everywhere except a few spots where it had been recently disturbed. The silence, according to Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, made the place feel like a church that had lost faith. Wolfe's brows moved. "Pearlie said that?" "No, I said it. and Pearlie objected. That got the faintest possible relaxation at the corners of Wolfe's mouth. Why bring this to me? Because the house interests me. Also because Reed was carrying a card with a name on it. Mine. Your card is distributed too freely. It was my old card, the one with the private line number we dropped 3 years ago. On the back he had penciled 2 words.
Ask Wolfe.
Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Indeed. I told Pearlie that if he wanted me to help him identify the corpse, save time, and spare public expense, I was a patriot, so I went. Reed was Reed, dead as regulation. Pearlie asked why a broker had my card. I told him because my charm reaches every branch of commerce. He made a note of it, probably under insolence. Then I came home. Wolfe put both palms on the chair arms. That is sometimes a warning to the furniture, and sometimes to me. Why did you not telephone? Because it was more entertaining to bring it in person. Also because if you had ordered me to go back at once, I wanted the chance to finish 1 cigarette first. You are slovenly. I am prudent. He closed his eyes. That meant either thought or irritation, and with Wolfe it was often both. After a moment he opened them again. Describe the house. So I did, from the outside in. On Mercer Street it stood between a machine shop and a building that sold imported rugs to people who liked their dust foreign. The front steps were stone, cracked but solid. The brass knocker had been polished recently. The parlor floor shutters were closed. Inside, the front hall was bare except for a strip of runner, so old it had outlasted taste and reached respectability again. No pictures, no umbrellas, no hats, no ashtrays, no signs of human comfort. The dining room at the rear had 1 chandelier with 2 bulbs working and 3 dead, a mantel without ornaments, and Reed on the floor beneath the light, as if somebody had wanted him found there and nowhere else. Upstairs were empty rooms with dust enough to record a confession, but only fragments of tracks, none useful yet. The kitchen had no food, 1 pan, 1 kettle, and a new bottle opener screwed to the wall. The cellar had a furnace in service and a coal bin with no coal. There was an odor, faint and clean, like soap laid over something stale. Wolfe listened without interrupting, which was tribute. When I finished, he asked, how had the house changed hands? I got part of it from Pearlie, and part from a clerk I know downtown. Sold first by an estate to a corporation called Linmere Holdings. 6 months later to one man, Edwin Vesey. 4 months after that to a woman, Mrs. Clara Don. Then last week to another corporation, Mercer Urban Development. If those are real owners, I am Queen Marie of Romania. You are not. Continue. No mortgage trail that makes sense. Prices shifted oddly. The first sale was low, the second high, the third lower again, the fourth absurdly moderate for the neighborhood, even if the house is cranky. Taxes paid promptly every time. Insurance changed carriers twice. The broker on the last transfer was Jasper Reed. Wolfe took a deep breath, then let it out. A house sold 4 times in 2 years, supposedly empty, with ownership passing through hands both legal and obscured. The broker is found dead there. Windows painted shut from within. Yes, Archie, it is interesting, I nodded. My own thought. Also, when I asked a woman in the next building whether anyone had lived there, she said no one had ever moved in furniture, but on some nights she had heard a piano. A piano. Very softly. She said perhaps a radio, but she used the word piano first. Names? The woman is Mrs. Gemler, widow, 60th a day, and devoted to curtains. The machine shop janitor is Louis Partridge. Pearlie has them both. Fritz came to the doorway and announced dinner. He did it as if revealing a treaty between nations. Wolfe rose, which was his contribution to haste, and we went to the dining room. If you have never eaten at Wolfe's table when Fritz Brenner has decided to comfort civilization, there is no way to make you understand by simple force of language. That evening he began with a clear soup, carrying the discreet authority of chicken and herbs, went on to sweetbreads, done with mushrooms and a brown sauce that deserved a witness, and concluded with pears poached in wine sauce, which I will not describe further, because the user had forbidden French words, and Fritz would have objected to any substitute I could invent. Wolfe ate with the concentration of a philosopher testing first principles. I ate with the speed of a healthy man who had spent 2 hours among policemen. During the meal, Wolfe spoke once. "The claim that the house was empty," he said, "may be the first lie." I put down my fork. That sounds like the line for chapter 1 of a memoir. It is a statement of probability. An empty house is not sold repeatedly at irrational prices unless emptiness itself is the merchandise, which is improbable. The bottle opener, the active furnace, the cleaned odor, the polished knocker, the painted windows. Someone used the place, either continuously or by arrangement. For what? If I knew, there would be no reason to leave my chair tomorrow. Then I can sleep. He ignored that. Did Reed go there to meet someone? Likely. There was no sign he had been dragged in. His hat was on a chair. He had his gloves in one pocket and a memorandum book in the other. The book was missing the last 2 pages, torn out cleanly. That R had more nourishment in it for Wolfe than the pears. When he found one fact worth chewing, he could live on it for hours. After dinner, he went upstairs for his evening hour with the orchids. Since even murder has to wait while Theodore Horst inspects roots and Wolfe emits sounds of devotion over cattleyas, I stayed in the office and did some work of my own. I telephoned Lon Cohen at the Gazette and got what any competent newspaperman in New York can get if you ask before the city desk goes wild. Jasper Reed, age 43, unmarried, office on Madison Avenue, no criminal record, no known debts worth panic. Modest reputation for handling awkward properties and discreet clients. He had lately been seen in company with Edwin Vesey, the second owner of the Mercer Street house, who was a dealer in architectural salvage. Vesey had once sold carved mantels and iron gates to rich men who want old houses without old discomforts. More lately, he had been buying storage lots and small properties. Clara Donny, the third owner, was the widow of a dentist and lived in Forest Hills, or claimed to. Mercer Urban Development had offices consisting of a desk in a lawyer's suite and a stenographer who knew nothing. Linmere Holdings had vanished into the swamp, where paper corporations breed and die. I also called Saul Panzer at home, because when I want facts with the fat trimmed off, I go to Saul if I can afford him. I told him only enough to interest him and asked him to learn what he could by morning about Reed, Vesey, Clara Don, and the usage of the Mercer Street house. He said he would. When Wolfe came down at 11, carrying the air of a man who had spent an hour among beings more rational than humans, I gave him the results. He said, "Tomorrow morning, Mr. Kramer will appear either personally or by telephone to complain that we are meddling. After he has done so, we may decide whether to continue. Suppose he doesn't. He will." Inspector Kramer did not disappoint. He arrived at 10:30 the next morning, jammed his hat on the red leather chair as if it were personally at fault, and glared at Wolfe. "I hear Goodwin was on Mercer Street last night, poking around before my men had finished. He was identifying a corpse," Wolfe said. "Would you prefer that he had misidentified it?" Kramer snorted. "He is a large man whose temper has always seemed to me both genuine and cultivated, like a trumpet player's lip. I don't care what he identified. I care why the dead man had your detective's card in his pocket." "I do not know. Then maybe you ought to stay out of it." Wolfe spread his fingers on the desk. "That advice is gratuitous. Does the police department now discourage private citizens from remaining at home?" Kramer turned to me. "Did Reed call here?" "No." "Did he write?" "No." "Did either of you know he was handling that house?" "No." Kramer grunted. "Maybe you still won't know anything after I tell you this. Reed was killed sometime between 7 and 9 last night. Not strangled. Cyanide, fast and ugly, administered in whiskey. 1 glass on the floor, 1 on the mantel. The second glass was wiped. No prints anywhere useful. Reed's notebook is gone, but we found a receipt in his pocket from a locksmith on Bleecker Street, dated yesterday afternoon. Paid cash." "A key," I said. "Maybe," Kramer snapped. "Maybe. A lock change, maybe copies, maybe nothing. And there's this. Reed telephoned someone from a booth at 6:15. We haven't pinned the number yet. Wolfe nodded. You are industrious. Kramer glared harder. Save the compliments. That house wasn't empty. A chair in the back bedroom had been sat in recently. There were cigarette ends in a pan in the sink. All the same brand, all smoked by one person as far as we can tell. There was fresh bread in the icebox. So if Goodwin has a bright idea, now is the time. I told him. Only one. Whoever used the house wanted it to look empty to the neighborhood, not to himself. That means secrecy mattered more than comfort. Kramer snorted again, but less contemptuously. We've got Vesey in to talk. Clara Don says she never set foot in the place after buying it and sold because the taxes annoyed her. That alone ought to get her 10 years. If you learn anything, Wolfe, you tell me. If I choose. Kramer made a sound which would have cracked plaster in a lesser house and got up to go. At the door he turned. One more thing. There's a piano bench in the back parlor. No piano. Dust everywhere except around the bench. Explain that. When he had gone, I looked at Wolfe. The woman next door heard piano. Yes, the bench means there was one. Yes. Portable Archie. Pianos are not ferrets. I grinned. Then maybe it was moved. Obviously. Why move a piano and leave the bench? To preserve the appearance of neglect badly, or because the bench concealed nothing worth carrying? Concealed. He gave me a look usually reserved for men who misuse breeding stock. A piano bench often has storage under the seat. Music, papers, miscellany. Then I'll go see it. No. First, the ownership trail. Also the locksmith. Also Mr. Reed's acquaintances in the last week. The bench can wait unless Kramer's men pry it open and discover the Constitution. That was assignment enough to keep a man from regretting his salary. I spent the rest of the day in motion. At the Hall of Records I leaned on a clerk Dunning who had once borrowed $50 from me and repaid it with gratitude instead of currency. From him and from the dry bones of filed documents, I got more than appeared at first glance. Linmere Holdings had been formed by a lawyer named Maurice Tull, now dead. Its mailing address had been a post office box. Edwin Vesey had bought the house from Linmere in his own name, but the funds had come through a trust account managed by Tull's former partner, Albert Bino. Clara Don had bought from Vesey with money transferred from an insurance settlement, but the settlement amount did not match the purchase price, unless she had another source. Mercer Urban Development had been organized by Bino himself only 3 weeks before the final sale. In other words, the paper owners changed, but the lawyer stayed near the center, like a spider who preferred contracts to webs. At 4 o'clock, Saul Panzer phoned. Saul wastes neither words nor breath. Vesey is nervous, he said. Talked too much at lunch to a woman in a hat shop. Says he got trapped into a foolish speculation and wished he had never heard of Mercer Street. Clara Don exists all right. Forest Hills apartment, sister living with her, money not plentiful. She is frightened. Reed met Bino twice last week. Also, Reed recently tried to hire a night watchman for a property he didn't name. He was turned down because he wanted no questions asked. Anything about actual use of the house. A delivery boy remembers taking groceries there on 3 occasions in the past month. Small orders. Bread, eggs, cold meat, whiskey, received by a man with a scarf over his throat and a grey hat. Describe the man medium, that narrows it. Any piano? A pause. Neighbor on the rear alley. Heard scales played in the afternoons about a month ago. Badly. I thanked him and hung up. When I gave Wolfe the report, he shut his eyes for half a minute. A broker, a salvage dealer, a widow without money, a lawyer, false emptiness, small provisions, occasional occupation, and a piano played badly, he murmured. A charming household, also a possible throat ailment and a grey hat. Accessy traits, the lawyer, Archie. Bino, yes. It is not impossible that he merely facilitated transactions for careless clients. It is also not impossible that he arranged the entire sequence. Have him here. I phoned Albert Bino's office. He was unavailable. I left a message saying Nero Wolfe wished to see him regarding Mercer Street and Jasper Reed. An hour later, Bino called back himself. His voice was smooth and careful, with the kind of ease some men cultivate, because they cannot afford honesty. He said he was naturally distressed by Mr. Reed's death. Yes. He had handled certain formalities regarding the Mercer Street property. Yes. He would be glad to meet Mr. Wolfe the next day at 11, provided the matter was strictly confidential. Wolfe, hearing my end of it, mouthed one word after I hung up. Fui? At 10 the next morning, Bino arrived. He was in his late 50s. Trim silver at the temples, dressed as if tailors sent him fruit at Christmas. He looked around the office with quick appreciation and no awe, which put him in a minority. He sat without waiting to be invited, which put him somewhere else. Mr. Wolfe, he said, I understand my name has surfaced in an ugly business. I should be grateful if you would tell me why. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Because you are connected with the sale of a house in which Jasper Reed was murdered. A legal connection only. Perhaps. Why was the house sold 4 times in 2 years? Speculation. The district has improved. Not enough to explain those prices. Bino smiled, not broadly. Markets are not always rational. No, but accountants usually are. I admired that one. Bino let it pass. I represented clients. That is all. Who used the house? No one, to my knowledge. I spoke. That is false. He turned his eyes to me. They were pale and dry. Mr. Goodwin, in your profession certainty is often theatrical. In mine, yes. In yours, expensive. Bino's smile thinned. If this is an interrogation, I decline it. Wolfe nodded. You may, but a man is dead. If you continue to be unhelpful, I will encourage Inspector Kramer to examine your affairs with vigor. There was silence then, stretched but not broken. Bino crossed one knee over the other with great care. I know only this, he said. Certain persons wished the property transferred discreetly, while a title irregularity was resolved. Temporary holding arrangements were convenient. Mr. Reed managed the practical side. What irregularity? I am not at liberty to say. Then you are at liberty to leave. Bino rose. I see. One warning, Mr. Wolfe. There are matters in New York better handled quietly. Wolfe's eyes opened wider by one fraction. All murder investigations would benefit from less conversation. Nevertheless, we persist. Good day, Mr. Bino. When the door had closed behind him, I exhaled. He could sour milk at 20 paces. He is frightened, Wolfe said. Of Kramer? Possibly. More likely of whatever Mr. Reed had discovered. Title irregularity? Maybe. But the phrase is too neat. He prepared it in advance. I was going to answer when the doorbell rang. A minute later, Fritz ushered in a woman who paused just inside the office, as if measuring whether she dared stay. She was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with a face that might have been merely pretty if Fearford had not sharpened it into distinction. Her coat was good, but not new. Her gloves had been mended by a careful hand. Mrs. Clara Donn, she said. I'm sorry to come without an appointment, but I was told if anyone could stop this from becoming worse, it would be Nero Wolfe. Wolfe inclined his head. Sit down. Why should it become worse? She sat, clasped her handbag tight, and looked once toward me, as if to make sure there was at least one human-sized person in the room. Because I lied to the police, she said. And because last night someone telephoned me and said that if I talked, I should be the next to die in that house. That was good enough for a beginning. She told us this much, before Wolfe raised a hand to stop her and have Fritz bring coffee. She had indeed bought the Mercer Street house, but not as an investment. She had bought it, or thought she had, for her brother Leonard, a pianist whose career had broken on drink and nerves. He had needed a place to hide, she said, after getting involved with men who used vacant properties for meetings and storage. Jasper Reed had persuaded her that a temporary transfer through her name would protect Leonard until a legal difficulty was settled. She had never trusted Reed, but she had trusted her brother. Leonard had lived in the house at intervals. He played the piano there. He was gone now. She did not know where. 2 nights ago, Reed had come to her and said everything had become dangerous. Yesterday he was dead. Wolfe asked one question after another, and her answers came with increasing strain. What men? She did not know names. What storage? She did not know. Why the repeated transfers? Reed had said it was necessary. Why had she sold out? Because Reed insisted. Because Leonard had vanished. Because she wanted out. And why had she lied to the police? Because Leonard had once been arrested in a drunken disturbance, and she was sure the police would fasten on him if they knew he had used the house. When she left, after Wolfe had told her with unusual gentleness that if she received another threat she was to notify us at once, the office stayed quiet for a full minute. Then I said, "A house for a hidden pianist." "No," Wolfe said. "A hidden pianist in a house for some other purpose." "You think she held back?" "Certainly. Also, she told the truth about one thing, only because she had no choice." "The piano. What now?" He took a deep breath and looked at the ceiling as if the plaster might improve its conduct. "Now, Archie, the house becomes more occupied. Find Leonard Don. Find who met Reed yesterday evening. And find why a supposedly empty house needed a broker, a lawyer, a salvage dealer, a frightened widow, and a piano." He closed his eyes. "The first lie," he said, "was not the murder. It was the claim that the house had ever been empty. And since Nero Wolfe, once interested, is as relentless as gravity, I knew Mercer Street had just become our address in everything but mail." Chapter 2. Archie goes to buy a memory. The next morning, Nero Wolfe gave me instructions in the tone he used when assigning a disagreeable but necessary task to a junior deity. "You will go to Mercer Street," he said, "not as yourself, which would contaminate the enterprise, but as a prospective purchaser with enough money to attract attention and not enough intelligence to repel it." I was at my desk with a cup of coffee, going over notes Saul had brought in person at 8:30. "That lets me be almost anybody in New York. Do not improvise beyond your capacity. Then I'll take a smaller part." He ignored that, which, with Wolfe, is sometimes a tribute. "There is a current agent, Milton Crane. He has advertised the house discreetly but not invisibly. You will have seen the notice through a banker who understands your taste for old properties. You want a place with character for eventual restoration, perhaps with a room suitable for books or music. You are not sentimental, but you are suggestible. Let him suggest. And if he asks my name, choose one you can remember. I have always admired the practical strain in your imagination." He took a sip of beer. It was only a little after 10, but Wolfe's ethics had never included an alliance with the clock. "Observe everything, if possible. Inspect the cellar, upper rooms, closets or mantels, and especially that room containing the piano bench. If you can do so without vulgarity, test whether the present arrangement of objects is recent. That house is already crawling with police memories. Memories are not evidence. Go." That was that. I took the alias of Kenneth Dale, a man from White Plains, with cash from an aunt and taste from a magazine. I picked a dark blue suit that hinted at solvency without proving it, a tie calm enough to reassure widows, and a hat that belonged to a citizen who paid taxes without resentment. By 11:30, I was in a taxi headed downtown, with Mercer Street growing toward me through the windshield, and all the usual Manhattan racket bumping along the sides. Mercer Street, in daylight, looked even less trustworthy than it had on the evening of Jasper Reed's death. The old house sat, narrow and upright, between its neighbors, like a spinster relative who knew something discreditable about everyone on the block and had never once considered dying with it. The brick front had been cleaned in patches and neglected in patches, so that it looked not weathered but revised. The brass knocker was bright enough to suggest care. The steps had been swept. One shutter on the parlor floor hung half an inch crooked, and somehow that looked deliberate too. I rang. I expected a wait, or at least the polite fiction of one. Instead, the door opened in less than 5 seconds. Milton Crane was a man in his middle 40s with black hair so glossy it seemed financed, a narrow face, and a smile arranged with professional exactitude. His suit was pearl gray and probably more expensive than mine. He took in my hat, shoes, gloves, and face with a speed that would have made a customs inspector proud. "Mr. Dale," he said. "That's right. Milton Crane? "Of Crane Realty. Won't you come in? I'm delighted you could make the time." He was too ready. A man selling a property with a bad smell in its past usually wastes a minute, pretending not to hope. Crane looked as if he had been posted there since dawn, waiting for a buyer, reckless enough not to ask the right questions. Inside the hall, the air had changed since the police tramped through it, or perhaps it had changed again. There was no dust on the runner. The walls had the dull, old cream tone you get when a house has been painted often and honestly, except near the baseboards where the finish looked fresher. A small table stood against the wall with a bowl on it, containing 2 keys and nothing else. It was not the sort of detail people leave in an empty house. It was the sort they set down to imply absence without admitting it. Crane saw me noticing. "One of the charms of the place," he said lightly. "It has survived enough years to keep its dignity." "Dignity is useful in a house," I told him. "So is plumbing." He smiled as if I had passed a test. "Both are present." He took me first into the front room on the parlor floor, which had probably been a formal drawing room in the days when people sat upright for recreation. It was mostly bare, but not entirely. There was one chair by the fireplace, turned at a neat angle toward the cold grate, as though an invisible occupant had lately risen from it after spending a thoughtful hour. There was also a small table by the wall. No book on it, no ashtray, no flower vase, no mess. The mantel had been cleaned recently, but not polished. That takes judgment. Polish it, and the room looks occupied. Leave it dead, and the place looks deserted. Clean it just enough, and it looks preserved. Crane spread a hand. "Magnificent proportions." "For what?" I asked. "Conversation, music, reading, a quiet life. That's 3 different lives. A good house can contain more than one." He said it smoothly, but the room itself argued. The chair was too exact. The angle toward the hearth was too literary. I had the sudden feeling that someone had arranged the room not for use, but for recollection, as if he were rebuilding a memory of how an old New York room ought to look when nobody was in it. We went to the rear parlor. There, the famous piano bench still stood, centered before a blank span of floor that was cleaner than the surrounding boards. The outline where the piano had once rested was faint but visible if you cared enough to look. I cared enough. The bench itself was walnut, worn at the corners, and the leather top had a split no recent restorer had bothered to repair. "Music room?" I asked. Crane gave me a quick glance. "Or library." The former owner had considered both. "Which former owner?" "The most recent individual owner." "That would be Mrs. Dunn." He smiled again. "The same amount." "You have done some homework." "I don't buy old houses by moonlight." "That is wise." I crossed to the bench and touched it with one finger, as if idly. No dust. I lifted the lid before he could stop me. Inside there were a few sheets of cheap music paper, blank, and a pencil clipped neatly along one side. That was wrong in 6 ways. Nobody leaves blank music paper in a bench by accident after clearing out a house. You leave old scores, old programs, perhaps a cracked metronome, perhaps nothing. Blank paper was a prop. It said piano without saying pianist. "Convenient," I observed. Crane shrugged. "Remnants. These places gather them." I shut the bench. "Funny kind of remnant, Mr. Dale. If you are looking for a house without history, I can show you apartments in glass towers, where the only memory is of the mortgage. This one offers character." There's that word again. He took me upstairs. On the bedroom floor, the front room had been left almost bare, except for curtains at the windows and a wardrobe with its doors open. Empty. Too empty. Empty in quotation marks. The back room held a bed frame without mattress and a small stand by the wall with a lamp on it. The lamp was polished. Not clean. Polished. Somebody had spent time on brass that no one was supposed to need. I touched the switch. It lit at once. Crane said, "Good wiring, or recent electricity. Would that offend you? Depends who paid the bill." He laughed politely. "You enjoy your questions. I enjoy answers more." On the top floor, things got stranger. One room had 3 cardboard boxes stacked in a corner, all empty, but neatly folded as if meant to represent moving. Another had a cracked mirror hanging above a washstand, and on the washstand stood a china cup with 2 matches in it. I picked one up, unused, modern. There was no reason on earth for 2 matches to stand in a cup in an empty room, except that somebody had thought the room looked too dead without them. I was beginning to enjoy myself, not because the house pleased me. It didn't. It put my nerves in the state usually induced by a smile from a man who has already decided to lie. But there is satisfaction in finding a pattern where someone else hoped you would only feel atmosphere. We went down to the kitchen. The floor had been scrubbed within the last day or 2. There was 1 iron pan hanging on a hook, 1 kettle on the stove, 1 dish towel folded with military precision, and in the icebox a bottle of ginger ale unopened. That nearly made me laugh. A thoughtful touch, I said. Do prospective buyers often faint? Crane looked annoyed for the first time. It passed quickly, but it had been there. One likes a property to seem cared for. This seems rehearsed. Do you object to order only when it poses as neglect? He drew himself up a little. Mr. Dale, are you seriously interested in purchasing the property? I'm seriously interested in knowing why a house this old, this narrow, and this overmanaged has changed hands like a hot coin. That landed. He did not move much, but his eyes altered. There is a moment when a salesman decides whether you are still a customer or have become a problem. I had crossed. Real estate records are public, he said. Surely you know that unusual transactions do not necessarily imply anything improper. Certainly not, but they imply something. He let the silence stay between us for 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Then he smiled once more and opened the cellar door. Since you are thorough, he said, you might as well inspect everything. That was interesting. A man with something in his cellar usually avoids the subject, or provides an explanation before the first stair creaks. Crane merely stood aside and let me go down. The cellar was dry, lit by a bare bulb, and cleaner than the ground floor had any right to be. The furnace was in order. Shelves lined one wall. On them stood 6 paint cans, all old labels but recently wiped, a toolbox, and 3 wooden crates marked glass. The crates were empty. The coal bin held no coal, just a scattering of dust and 1 folded piece of burlap. I picked it up, nothing in it. At the back of the cellar, there was a locked door. I turned. Storage. Old utility space. Nothing of consequence. Let's see it. I have no key. That may have been true. He produced a ring and showed it to me with bland patience. No key there fit the lock. I bent to inspect it. New brass, installed recently. The floor before it showed marks where something had been dragged across within the last week. Well, I said, if I buy the place, I'll want that open. Then it can be arranged. That phrase has a long history. Crane's smile now could have cut wrapping paper. Dale, perhaps this house is not for you. Perhaps not, but I haven't seen the dining room. By all means. He led me back upstairs. The dining room, where Jasper Reed had died, had been restored almost to neutrality. The police had finished with it, and whoever managed the house had been busy since. The mantel was cleared. The floor had been cleaned, but not entirely. Near the center, if you knew where to look, there was a faint roughness in the boards, where liquid had seeped and been wiped. The chandelier glowed politely above us. Crane was watching me now as much as the room. This could be transformed, he said. Paneled walls, proper draperies, a long table. Why hasn't it been? He spread his hands. Each owner had plans, but no appetite. He gave a little laugh. Perhaps. What did Jasper Reed think of it? That hit him harder than the previous one. He covered well. I beg your pardon. I said, what did Reed think of it? I understand he handled one of the transfers. Mr. Reed managed several introductions in the neighborhood. His death is unfortunate. Unfortunate is a cozy word for poison. His eyelids flickered once. I see you are well informed. I like to know where people have died before I buy. That was too much, and perhaps exactly enough. He ceased smiling altogether. Mr. Dale, if your purpose in coming here is to collect gossip rather than evaluate property, our business is finished. I nodded. Maybe. One last thing. Who arranged these rooms? These rooms, the chair by the grate, the lamp. The blank paper in the bench, the boxes upstairs, the ginger ale. It all says the house has been gently paused, not abandoned. Who paused it? You have an imaginative temperament. I try to keep it caged. He stepped toward the hall. Good day. He had not answered. That was an answer. I let him escort me to the front door. On the threshold, I turned for one more glance into the hallway. The runner there, too new for the faded floor beneath it, lay perfect straight from the entry to the back. You notice things like that when you have spent enough time in houses. Old floors and new runners do not become friends at once. They fight, wrinkle, slip, and make a nuisance of themselves. This one lay as if installed by geometry. Outside, with the door closed behind me, I did not go straight to the taxi stand. I crossed the street, strolled half a block, doubled back, and entered the machine shop next door. It smelled of oil, metal, and honest labor, 3 fragrances Mercer Street had no use for. The janitor, who had found Reed, was not on duty, but a machinist in shirt sleeves was willing to trade remarks for cigarettes. His name was Hanley, and he had the broad face of a man who trusted lathes more than conversation. "You asking about the dead broker?" he said after the first cigarette. "Not exactly. I'm thinking of buying that house." He barked a laugh. "Then think harder! What's wrong with it?" He jerked his thumb toward the wall. "At night, not every night, somebody's in and out. Quiet. No furniture vans, no family life, nothing ordinary. Then for a while, nothing at all, then again. Couple of months back, I heard piano through the wall, bad scales. After that, one evening sounded like arguing. Man and woman, couldn't hear words. Then nothing. House always looks empty, though. Who had keys?" He shrugged. "More than one. Saw the broker. Saw a lean guy with a scarf once or twice. Saw a woman, maybe the widow type. Saw another one, too." "What another one?" He frowned. "Youngish fellow. Good coat, soft hat, looked like he belonged uptown. Came twice that I saw. Didn't stay long. Would you know him again? Maybe. Maybe not." I asked him about moving vans, deliveries, repairs. He remembered a piano going in by the side entrance perhaps 6 weeks before Christmas and coming out again at night, not long after New Year's. 2 men and a truck with no markings. That was useful. He also remembered a locksmith one afternoon last week. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office, planted behind his desk, with a folder open and a face that suggested the folder had failed him morally. Saul Panzer sat in the red leather chair. Ori Cather and Fred Durkin had gone, but their traces remained in the ashtray and on Wolfe's temper. "Well?" Wolfe asked. I gave it to him in order, beginning with Milton Crane's 2 ready reception and ending with the runner. Saul listened too, eyes half shut. Wolfe interrupted only twice. Once to ask exactly where the locked cellar door stood, and once to ask whether the music paper in the bench was ruled or blank. "Ruled," I said. "Blank of notes." "Phooey." "Continue." When I was done, Saul spoke. "Crane is not clean. He worked for Reed on 3 previous properties. No record, but a smell. Also, Bino had lunch yesterday with a man named Gilbert Neff, who imports specialty fittings for interiors. Expensive ones." "Fittings," I said, "and Vesey deals in architectural salvage. Old mantels, gates, paneling." Wolfe nodded without looking at either of us. "A house arranged as period theatre. Transfers through disposable ownership. Selective occupation. A piano to humanize it. Staged neglect." "Archie, what was being sold?" "The house." "No, a story." He opened his eyes and looked at me. "Yes, but to whom?" That was the point. The house had not felt prepared for living. It had felt prepared for inspection by someone expected to care about age, refinement, continuity. Not an ordinary buyer. A believer. Someone who wanted old New York in concentrated form, and either had enough money to buy illusion or enough need to rent it, Saul said. Could be used to entertain clients. "Then why the repeated ownership changes?" Wolfe asked. "To bury paper." "Perhaps." I stood up and went to the globe, turned it idly, and let my mind scratch at it. 1 chair by the grate, 1 lamp polished, 1 runner too new, 1 bench too ready with blank paper. It felt like a stage set for a house that once existed but not quite for this one. Even the kitchen was false, not equipped for a person. equipped for the idea of a person. I kept thinking someone had rebuilt a version of the past and prayed nobody would test the walls. Wolfe grunted. For him that can be applause. Excellent, Archie. Test the walls. I beg your pardon? Literally, if opportunity offers, figuratively at once. Why would anyone need a counterfeit old interior in an authentic old house? Vesey supplies salvage. Neff imports fittings. Crane markets illusion. Bino handles paper. What function connects them? High-priced fraud. Likely. But fraud directed at what appetite? Nostalgia? Secrecy? Prestige? Illicit transactions often require scenery. Saul moved in his chair. There is something else. Leonard Donne has been found once before in company with wealthy amateurs. Not criminals exactly. Society patrons, music collectors, decorators. He played private evenings in places not open to the public. That set my ears up. Collectors of what? Atmosphere, maybe. Wolfe tapped a finger once on the desk. Yes. At that moment the front bell rang. Fritz went to answer. A minute later he ushered in Inspector Kramer, who looked as if he had been chewing roofing nails without sauce. What now? I asked him. He ignored me and addressed Wolfe. You've talked to Albert Bino and Clara Donne. Wolfe nodded. Yes, they didn't tell you everything. We picked up Milton Crane an hour ago for questioning, and he sings in fragments. Not enough to make an arrest worth keeping, but enough to annoy me. He says Reed had a side business arranging old houses for private use by clients who wanted authentic surroundings. That's his phrase. He won't say more unless it's him something. I sat down. Authentic surroundings for what? Griff shot me a sour glance. If I knew, I wouldn't be here. Reed handled access, Vesey, and another man handled interiors, and payments came through shell companies. There may have been gambling, blackmail, affairs, art deals, or seances, for all I know. Crane claims he never asked. I believe him only because he's not smart enough to lie well for long. His lips moved in a small disgusted arc. Mr. Reed sold memory. Kramer stared. What? A house made not to be lived in, but to be believed. Old New York, compressed and rentable. Privacy clothed in pedigree. I said a stage set with a title deed. Kramer turned to me. Are you two done admiring yourselves? Not quite, I told him. There's a locked room in the cellar, that got him. What locked room? I told him. He swore with spirit. Crane didn't mention that. Then he must have forgotten his architecture. Kramer planted both fists on Wolfe's desk. Listen, I've got Reed poisoned in that dining room. A broker running fake or crooked historical properties. Missing pianist. A lawyer with paper all over it. And a widow too scared to tell the truth. If either of you is holding out, I'll have Goodwin sleeping on a bench tonight. I never sleep on benches, I said. Not without upholstery, Wolfe said. Archie visited as a buyer and has now told you what he observed. You are welcome. Kramer exhaled through his nose. I'm going back there with a warrant. Certainly. He straightened. And if I find that your detective tampered with anything, I'll use his necktie to mark exhibits. When he had gone, Saul rose. I'll keep after Neff. Wolfe nodded. Do so also, Leonard Donne. He may be less central than his sister fears, but he is certainly connected. Saul left. I settled behind my desk and watched Wolfe, watching nothing. After a while I said, You're building something. Yes, you might share a brick. He looked at me. Very well. A business existed. Perhaps unique, perhaps not. It supplied controlled settings, false continuity, and privacy. Wealthy persons who wished to inhabit a version of the past, or to conduct present transactions in an atmosphere of inherited legitimacy, paid for the privilege. Reed arranged access. Vesey and others furnished authenticity. Bino insulated ownership. But why the repeated transfers? Why the house itself rather than simpler rentals? Why poison Reed now? And why was Leonard Donne installed there with a piano? Music improved the illusion, probably. Yet music also attracts memory. A piano is not merely furniture. It says cultivation. It domesticates secrecy. I leaned back. So Reed had a business turning old houses into rentable memories. Nice line of work until one of the memories bites. Wolfe closed his eyes. The matter is still shallow. There is a deeper use. I was considering whether to ask him how many revelations he expected me to pay for this week when the telephone rang. I picked it up. It was Clara Don, and her voice was so tight I nearly missed the words. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. "He's back." "Who?" "My brother, Leonard. He came to my apartment 20 minutes ago. He was frightened, and before I could stop him, he left again. He said only that Jasper should never have trusted the room under the house." That was enough to get me on my feet. Did he say where he was going? No, but he looked ill. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm afraid he means to go there." I put my hand over the transmitter and told Wolfe. His eyes opened at once. "Go." I was already in the hall, reaching for my coat. As I got the door open, Wolfe's voice came after me from the office, level and exact. "Archie, buy the memory if you must, but this time test the cellar first." That was good advice, and it nearly came too late. Chapter 3. Wolfe listens to wood and plaster. When Nero Wolfe tells you to go, he usually means now, and when he adds advice on top of that, it is because he suspects you may have one chance to use it before events become expensive. I got to Clara Don's apartment in Forest Hills in 38 minutes, which, for New York traffic, was not driving, but theology. Leonard Don had gone. Clara, pale and miserable, and blaming herself with a thoroughness no jury could have improved, could tell me only that her brother had looked worn to rags inside his skin, had smelled of rain and bad tobacco, and had kept turning his head at every street noise, as if he expected his own name to come through the window carrying a revolver. He had stayed no more than 5 minutes. He had said Jasper Reed had been a fool, that Albert Bino would sell his grandmother's grave if paper could be before it, and that the room under the house had ruined everything. "What room?" I asked her. He didn't say. I thought he meant the cellar. He said Jasper should never have trusted it. Then he said they would all say he was drunk again, which for once was not true. He wanted money. I gave him $20. He left. "Did he say where he was hiding?" She shook her head. "No, but he asked whether the house on Mercer Street had been closed by the police. When I said I didn't know, he looked almost relieved. That was enough to keep me from wasting time with sympathy, though I gave her some anyway. By the time I reached Mercer Street, the block was busy with the kind of attention murder breeds after the newspapers have had a day to nibble it. A patrolman stood at the door. Inspector Kramer's warrant had beaten me by perhaps 10 minutes, and I was just enough late to be annoyed. Kramer himself was in the cellar when I got there. I knew because I could hear him objecting to the architecture from half a floor above. The locked door at the back had been forced. The brass lock, so fresh and self-important that morning, now hung sideways like a drunk after payday. I went down and found Kramer, Deepens, a plainclothes man with a flashlight, and a smell like damp lime and old wood. The room beyond the door was small, windowless, and bare, except that it wasn't bare at all. A section of the far wall had been recently rebuilt. The brick color was slightly wrong. The mortar lines were too obedient. Kramer swung on me. "I thought you'd miss me." He jabbed a thumb at the wall. "There's a crawl space behind that, or there was. We haven't broken through yet because the city likes warrants, and I like not getting yelled at by judges. But if there's something back there, I'll have it in 10 minutes, Pearlie said. "Funny thing is, this wall wasn't here long ago. Floor dust says so." I moved closer. The patch was maybe 6 feet across and 7 high. Not a full wall, just a false one, a new obstruction in an old cellar. I thought of Leonard Don's words and of Milton Crane's too neat smile. Reed had trusted the room under the house. Trusted it for what? "Any sign of Don?" I asked. "None," Kramer said. "And if he shows up, he'll get a handshake from me you can hear in Queens." A workman arrived with tools, and Kramer's respect for judges endured another 90 seconds. Then the first brick came out. Behind it there was darkness and a drift of stale air. More bricks came. The hole widened. The plainclothes man played his flashlight beam inside and gave a low sound that was not quite a whistle. The crawl space was less a room than a passage, narrow, braced with timber, running under the rear of the house. There was enough clearance for a man to crouch or wriggle. At the near end stood a wooden crate, lid off. The flashlight found packing straw, a torn cloth, and the glitter of metal fittings wrapped in paper. "Bring that out," Kramer snapped. They did. The fittings were old brass escutcheons, drawer pulls, small hinges, lock plates, all of them cleaned and tagged with little penciled numbers. They looked exactly like what Edwin Vesey might sell to a rich fool who wanted an old room improved with old hardware and would know the difference only if told. "Decorating supplies," I said. Kramer grunted. "Keep your jokes." The second crate held pieces of molding. The third, rolled canvases painted to imitate age-darkened wall panels. Not one of them explained cyanide. But what interested me more was the passage itself. It had not been built for storage. It had been made to conceal access. At the far end, barely visible, there was another obstruction. A timbered frame, perhaps another door or hatch. Something in the way the beams met told me it had been arranged rather than inherited. Kramer saw it too. "Get a light down there," Pearlie muttered. "Place is built like a lie." That was all I needed from Mercer Street for one afternoon. I left Kramer to his walls and headed back to the brownstone with the facts in one pocket and my conclusions still refusing to sit still. Wolfe was in the office, naturally, and as naturally he did not ask whether I had eaten lunch. He asked instead. "Well," I told him. He listened with his eyes half shut and his fingertips touching. When I got to the false wall and the crates, he grunted. When I got to the passage and the second obstruction, he opened his eyes. "Yes," he said, "a building altered piecemeal. Kramer thinks hidden storage. Of course he does. He is paid to begin with the obvious. He also thinks Leonard Don may show up there. Possibly. Did you?" "No. But if there's a hole under the house, Leonard knew about it, and Reed trusted it. Then whatever mattered wasn't in the dining room where Reed died. It was below." Wolfe nodded once. "Now the papers." That was the part he had been waiting for. Since early morning, I had already put in calls and sent Fred Durkin to fetch what could be fetched faster by shoe leather than by courtesy. By 4 o'clock, the top of my desk looked like an accountant's after a hurricane. Title papers, repair invoices, permits, insurance riders, receipts from hardware suppliers, plumbing estimates, a brick mason's bill, 2 carpenter contracts, and one typed memorandum, so careful in its vagueness that only a lawyer could have written it without blushing. Wolfe had no intention of trusting brokers, deeds, or neighborhood talk when timber and brick were available for examination, but he knew the timber and brick would have to be translated first into paper. That translation was my department. I began laying it out for him. The estate sale to Linmere Holdings included no repairs. 6 months later, after Vesey bought, there was a permit for front stair reinforcement and replacement of 3 interior hinges. Small job. Then 1 month later, a plaster patch in the rear parlor wall. Nothing extensive on paper, but the invoice mentions matching previous finish, which means somebody cared how old it looked. Then, when Clara Don owned it, there was cellar brick reinforcement at the rear foundation and a charge for narrowing passage walls in the cellar access. Wolfe lifted a brow. Narrowing? That is the exact word. Odd, wait. After Mercer Urban Development took title, there was a bill for custom runner installation in the main hall, a lamp rewiring in the back bedroom, replacement sash weights for 2 upper windows that were nevertheless painted shut, and a private carpentry contract with no permit, cash only, described as interior adjustments per instruction. He leaned back, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly. Each owner paid for one isolated improvement. Yes, here a hinge, there plaster, cellar brick, then passage narrowing, then runner, lamp, sash weights. None of it improves the house in any sensible way. Not for living in, not for resale either. It is as if several strangers were each hired to complete one piece of a hidden design without knowing the whole of it, or knowing enough not to want the whole of it in writing, Wolfe said. I handed him the brick mason's invoice. Rear cellar reinforcement, dimensions small, labor high. That fits the false wall. He looked at it, then at the carpenter's sheet, and the narrowed passage walls, maybe to create the crawl space or disguise it. He shut his eyes. That means his brain has gone indoors, where there is no weather. After a full minute, he said, "The building is speaking plainly. The difficulty is only that it speaks in carpentry instead of words." I sat back. "You are enjoying this?" "No, liar." He opened his eyes. Yes. It had gone beyond a murder in a dining room. That much was clear. Somebody had been altering the structure of Mercer Street, bit by bit, spreading the work over different owners and different contracts. So no single paper trail, if examined, would describe the whole. No contractor would know he was helping build concealment. One man patched plaster, another reinforced brick. A third narrowed a passage. A fourth installed something decorative to distract the eye upstairs. And somewhere in that progression, Jasper Reed had gone from broker to caretaker of whatever the house had become. I resumed. One more item. Repair records on the rear parlor floor. Slight gouges and screw-hole fill, about where a piano would have stood. The work was done after the first transfer, before Clara Donne, before Leonard was installed. Right. So the room may have held something else first. Then later the piano got brought in to soften the scene. Or to disguise sound, Wolfe murmured. I stared. Sound? Yes. A piano played badly in the afternoons can conceal many lesser noises. Hammering, movement, work in the cellar, persons entering and leaving. Then Leonard was more useful than decorative. Likely both. At that moment the front bell rang. Fritz, admitted Saul Panzer, who never looks, hurried, because he sees no reason to make a spectacle of work. He took the red leather chair and handed me a folded sheet. Leonard Donne has been found twice in the last 6 months at a furnished room on 10th Avenue under the name Lee Dorr. He is not there now. The landlady says he came and went irregularly and once had a man with him. Tall, thin, smooth face, expensive coat. I asked. Saul shrugged. Could be. The landlady notices coats better than faces. And Gilbert Neff? Wolfe asked. Worth noticing. He imports reproduction hardware, period light fixtures, old-look wallpaper, hand-planed flooring, all priced for rich customers who like the past when it comes with invoices. 3 years ago he was nearly indicted in Boston over forged provenance on interior pieces sold as original 18th century salvage. Slipped clear. Reed knew him well. Vesey did business with him. Crane too. That's a family, I said. Saul nodded. Also, Jasper Reed rented warehouse space in Long Island City under a company name linked loosely to Bino's office. The lease ended last month. Neighbors remember crates, rolled panels, and one upright piano. That fit so neatly it almost made me angry. Wolfe looked at me. The house is a showroom, but not for buyers alone. It is assembled illusion. Not merely an old house, but a controlled old house. Modulated, tunable, staged. Reed sold experience, secrecy, and authenticity, whether genuine or fabricated. Saul added, there's more. One of Reed's clients was a man named Horace M. Van, collector, widower, rich enough to insult nations. He buys houses, rooms, libraries, complete interiors. He once paid a fortune for a staircase because some duke's mistress had fallen down it. Van visited Mercer Street twice last month. I gave a low whistle. Now we have an appetite, Wolfe grunted. Yes, a buyer of memory. That put new weight on everything. Horace Van was exactly the sort who might pay for illusion with respectability glued to it. A house on Mercer Street, apparently old, quiet, and privately transferable, could be marketed not merely as real estate, but as an inherited chamber of New York itself. A place where deals, entertainments, assignations, or private performances could be staged under the flattering cover of history. But why the hidden passage? Why the false wall? Why poison Reed? And why, above all, had the transactions grown frantic lately, with ownership changing hands faster than a card in a shell game? Wolfe asked Saul. Any indication Van intended to buy? Unknown. But Reed met him twice at the Knickerbocker Club and once at a private dinner. Van also engaged Leonard Donne for one small recital 2 years ago. I looked at Wolfe. Then Leonard connects the clients to the music and the atmosphere. Yes, still doesn't give us murder. No, but it gives us motive classes, fraud, exposure, extortion, panic. Saul rose. I'll keep going. When he had left, Wolfe told me to bring all the papers to his desk, and then did a thing I have seen him do perhaps 50 times, and never without profit. He stopped treating documents as records, and began treating them as actions. One bill meant someone had entered the house with a hammer. Another meant another man had measured a wall and been told only enough to finish one section. A permit meant someone wanted the city to see one thing and not ask about another. A cash memorandum meant someone wanted no city attention at all. Wolfe, sitting in his chair with his eyes moving from one page to the next, was not reading. He was reconstructing footsteps. Here, he said at last, tapping the cellar invoice. Mason reinforces rear cellar brick, but only from the interior. Not structurally necessary unless weight was to be borne against it. The false wall, I said. Yes, or something behind it. Then the narrowed passage. If a pre-existing cellar route was made smaller, it was not for convenience. It was to control access or create concealment. Then upstairs, decorative adjustments to normalize the visible house. The runner guides the eye. The polished lamp implies occupancy. The chair by the grate suggests life. Counterfeit domesticity. That was my impression. I know. And you were right. When Nero Wolfe says that to me, I do not ask him to repeat it. By early evening, Fred Durkin came in with 2 more items, both worth having. One was a receipt from a demolition contractor who had removed non-original, internal partitioning from Mercer Street 14 months earlier. The other was an old insurance survey, 8 years back, showing the cellar plan before any of the recent owners got busy. The rear section had once included a coal room and a narrow service corridor leading toward the neighboring property line. There, Wolfe said, the service corridor, now altered into the crawl space, not precisely, into something created from it. The old house offered a skeleton. The conspirators supplied fresh tissue. I grinned. That line belongs in a medical thriller. It belongs here because it is accurate. He pushed the survey toward me. Compare dimensions. I did. The current cellar layout, as observed by me and Kramer, no longer matched the old plan. The rear corridor had been shortened, the coal room reduced, and the measurements left a discrepancy of nearly 4 feet across one section. 4 feet in a New York house is not air, it is purpose. I looked up. There's another cavity. Almost certainly. And if Reed trusted the room under the house, then the room is not the crawl space Kramer found. That is only the outer shell. Wolfe nodded. At last. That brought me to my feet. Then I go back there. No, I stared. No. You will not compete with Mr. Kramer in his own excavation. He would arrest you from principle, and perhaps from pleasure. Instead, you will get me photographs of the interior alterations if possible, and meanwhile we will pursue the paper meaning. There is still the question of title. The title irregularity Bino hinted at. Yes, it may be false in one sense and true in another. Suppose the house itself is not the principal asset. Suppose what is beneath it, behind it, or accessible through it is the thing conveyed. I frowned. A tunnel, perhaps, or a chamber, or access to an adjoining property. Old Manhattan offers many architectural vulgarities. That sent me to the map cabinet. We had fire insurance maps, borough surveys, and enough city paper to shame a planning board. I spread the relevant sheet on my desk. Mercer Street, row of lots, depths marked, structures outlined. The neighboring machine shop had been 2 old houses long ago, joined internally. Behind the rear yards ran a service strip, then another building fronting the next street. Wait, I said. If the cellar corridor ran toward the property line, and if the old plan predates the machine shop conversion, then there may once have been shared utility access between houses. Exactly. Then the false wall could hide not storage but passage. To where? I bent over the map. Either next door or rearward. Hard to tell from this scale, then determine it. Before I could, the telephone rang, I answered. It was Pearlie Stebbins. sounding as if he had run out of patience and was borrowing against tomorrow's. Goodwin, tell your boss we found a second barrier at the end of that crawl space. Behind it is a narrow chamber with shelving and one desk. No body, no Leonard Donne. But there are burnt papers in a pan and a smell of fresh mortar. Also get this, there's a trap in the floor. A trap to where? Below, maybe. We haven't opened it yet. Kramer says, if Wolfe knows anything, he'd better start loving the police department. I thanked him with more sincerity than he expected and relayed it. Wolfe shut his eyes. Yes, that's all. What else is needed? A secret chamber beneath a secret passage inside. A supposedly empty house whose ownership rotates through controlled hands. Mr. Reed sold not merely atmosphere but access. The house changed hands too easily because the deed was only camouflage. And the trap? That will tell us what the building has been saying since the beginning. He opened his eyes and looked, not at me but at the old insurance survey. Archie, tonight you will dine adequately and sleep if possible. Tomorrow we shall have visitors, perhaps unwilling ones. Before that, I want Albert Bino, Edwin Vesey, Milton Crane if he is free on bail, Clara Dunn, and if heaven is not entirely asleep, Leonard Dunn. One of them knows what lies under Mercer Street, and another knows why Jasper Reed died before he could sell it, expose it, or steal it. Which is which? He picked up the sheet showing hinge replacements and plaster patches and runner installation, and gave it the sort of look a judge might give a pickpocket who had claimed to be in textiles. The carpentry is nearly done speaking, he said. Tomorrow we listen to the liars. Chapter 4. The name that had been removed if Nero Wolfe had ever been born a medieval prince instead of a private detective. He would have had monks in 3 scriptoria, comparing tax rolls, while he sat under a canopy and asked one question every hour. As it was, he had me, Saul Panzer, a filing cabinet that had gone farther into municipal vice than most aldermen, and an appetite for certainty that could make paper confess. The morning after Pearlie Stebbins telephoned about the secret chamber and the trap in its floor, I was at my desk by 8:30, with coffee, a city directory, 2 insurance surveys, a list of permit numbers, and an expression that would have improved if someone had sent diamonds. Wolfe had already finished breakfast and was pretending to read while actually thinking, which, with him, is like a battleship pretending to float. He spoke without lifting his eyes from the book. Boone. I looked up. What, Archie? When a house acquires false ownership, concealed spaces, and a carefully staged domestic history, the true occupants are rarely the named ones. Find the unnamed one. That is one of the reasons I stayed with Nero Wolfe. He could turn half a hint into a full day's labor and make it sound like a compliment. Any reason for Boone? I said. Or did you just wake with the word on your lips? Wolfe put the book down. The old insurance survey shows a notation, partly overwritten, beside the service corridor on the cellar plan. The clerk who amended it used different ink. Under the later note there is the beginning of a surname, B-O-O. It may be Boone or Boody or Booth. Boone is likelier. That's wizardry. No, it is a sight. I got to work. At the Hall of Records, with help from a clerk who respected my smile enough to risk his pension. I pulled utility ledgers, assessment sheets, rental registrations, and the kind of municipal leftovers that survive, because no one has yet found time to throw them away. The Mercer Street house had not been consistently owner-occupied, even before the recent acrobatics. There had been lodgers, caretakers, and short-term tenancies over the years. Most were ordinary enough, which is to say underpaid, under-recorded, and grateful to have a roof. Then, in a utility ledger from 11 years back, I found him. Walter Boone. The entry was light, almost embarrassed. Occupant for less than a year. Coal account opened in October, closed in March. Groceries billed twice weekly by a nearby merchant, who had since retired and taken his memory to Florida. No formal lease filed in the property folder. No renewal. On the next ledger page, the name had been rubbed nearly away. Not crossed out, not corrected, but rubbed, as if someone had taken a damp cloth to the page. and then thought better of finishing the job. You could still make out the ghost of the letters if you held the paper at an angle and let the light find the scratches. I took it to the clerk. "Who does that?" I asked him. He peered. "Nobody honest." "Can you tell when?" "Not exactly. Different hand from the original notation. Looks like somebody wanted the line unreadable without tearing the page. That means office work, not burglary." "Friendly," he shrugged. "You want friendly. Don't work in archives." There was more. In the same folder lay 3 cash receipts, copied into a maintenance book. One for coal, one for groceries, and one for a locksmith visit late in the winter. No proper lease termination, no forwarding address, no death notation, nothing. A man existed in the house for months, then stopped existing in the records as neatly as if his name had offended the paper. By noon, I was back in the office, laying it out for Wolfe. "Walter Boone," I said. "Occupant or caretaker, maybe tenant, for less than a year, over a decade ago." Then scrubbed from later documents. Not fully, but enough to discourage curiosity. Cash receipts only at the end. Coal, groceries, 1 locksmith, then nothing. Wolfe held out his hand. I gave him the copies. He read them, his lips tightening very slightly. "No death notice?" he asked. "None. No forwarding address?" "No. No lease termination?" "Nothing proper," he nodded. "Good. Saul Panzer, who had come in soundlessly enough to make me suspicious he had learned levitation, took the red leather chair and crossed one leg. "I found Boone," he said. I turned. "You did?" "That depends on what counts as finding. Walter Boone, age uncertain, once worked in a title office downtown. Not a lawyer, not a clerk of distinction, just a man with eyes and access to papers. 9 or 10 years ago, he quietly raised questions about a disputed deed connected to Mercer Street. No formal complaint, but 2 people remember him saying the chain on the property smelled of a substitution. After that, he left the title office. Reason unknown. No wife, no children, no military record I could find. Then he appears in nothing substantial." Wolfe said. "Excellent," I said. "Only if we like missing men." Saul continued. "One more item. Boone later worked briefly for a surveyor. Small jobs, basement measurements, old lot boundaries, utility routes. Then no trace again. I found 1 boarding house address in Brooklyn. Dead 3 years after his stay. No death certificate there either. That made the room feel smaller, not because of fear, but because the case had added depth under our feet. Walter Boone had once worked in a title office. He had questioned a Mercer Street deed. He had later dealt in measurements and lot lines. He had then occupied the house briefly, and afterwards someone had rubbed his name nearly out of the story." Wolfe leaned back and shut his eyes. "Well," I said, "that's a cheerful little sequence." "It is precise," Wolfe murmured. "Precise enough to suggest Boone found something." "Yes. And then either vanished or got vanished." Saul, who wastes no syllable unless forced, added, "There's a rumor. Thin, but worth a thread. Boone once told a man in a lunchroom that some old houses weren't worth buying for what stood on them, but for what they connected to." I let out a breath. "Connected to what?" Saul lifted a shoulder. He didn't say. Or the lunchroom witness didn't remember because the pie was better than the conversation. Wolfe opened his eyes. "Connected," he repeated. "Not contained. That favors passage rather than chamber." I nodded slowly. "A hidden route. Between properties, possibly. Or to storage, not included in the lot line. Or to some legacy access retained from older construction." Then Boone's title office experience mattered, because he could see where ownership on paper and ownership in brick failed to agree. "Yes." Wolfe took another look at the copied ledger entry with Boone's damaged name. He was removed from the house's history by intention. That was the center of it. Not lost, not overlooked, not forgotten by clerical drift. Removed. The difference is the difference between dust and fingerprints. The telephone rang. I got it. It was Fred Durkin, who had been chasing old directories and insurance maps uptown. "Archie," he said, "I found an old municipal sewer and utility diagram that covers the Mercer block. There used to be a service vault line running behind the row houses. before the machine shop expanded. Most were sealed when utilities modernized, but one notation shows private retained access on the Mercer lot. No details. Year is wrong for current ownership. How wrong? Older than Boone. Maybe inherited from the original owner or a later commercial adaptation. Can you get a copy? I already have. That was Fred. When he did have a thought, he didn't make a parade of it, but he usually brought a souvenir. I relayed the information. Wolfe did not move for several seconds. Good, he said. Now the disputed deed. Saul nodded. I'm on no, Wolfe said. Archie you, the title issue is not abstract. Boone noticed a substitution. Find the point at which the Mercer Street chain diverges from the physical reality of the property. That is the kind of order you obey first, and complain about later. I spent the next 2 hours in a condition best described as documentary trench warfare. Deeds, easements, boundary descriptions, mortgage abstracts, tax maps, all the paper machinery by which a city convinces itself that land can be reduced to sentences. At 3:15 I found the seam. An old deed, 50 years back, describing the Mercer Street parcel, referred to the dwelling and appurtenant rear service rights customarily enjoyed thereto. That phrase later disappeared. Not in a dramatic revision, not underlined or litigated, but quietly absent in a subsequent abstract. It had been replaced by a cleaner modern description of lot dimensions only. To a normal buyer, that meant nothing. To a title office man, with time and suspicion, it meant somebody had simplified away a right connected to the property. I sat looking at the copy and grinned. When I handed it to Wolfe, he read the phrase aloud. Appurtenant rear service rights customarily enjoyed thereto. Delightful. A legal rag for dusting away an inconvenient connection. Boone must have noticed it. Of course, he then asked questions. Perhaps he went into the house. Perhaps he measured. Perhaps he discovered a surviving root or chamber linked to that old right. Then he disappeared from the narrative. I lit a cigarette. And now, years later, Reed and Company rebuild the house around that same hidden design. Yes. For what? Smuggling? Private access for clients? Hidden storage for fake antiques? Secret meetings? All possible and all insufficient. He was right. Any one of those might explain part of it, but not the repeated ownership changes, the stage-managed domesticity, the pianist, and the frantic recent activity. Reed had not merely discovered an old architectural convenience. He had monetized it. The question was how. At 4 o'clock, Saul returned with the disputed D thread tightened. Boone's question at the title office was about a substitution in a copied abstract, he said. Original phrase included service rights. Later summary omitted it. Not illegal on its face, if considered obsolete, but Boone thought it was still physically meaningful, because adjoining properties showed hints of dependent access in survey marks. He asked the wrong senior clerk twice. After that, he was advised to concern himself with newer files. By whom? I asked. Saul's mouth moved one fraction. Maurice Tull. I whistled softly. Tull, dead now, had formed Linmere Holdings, the first shell in the recent Mercer Street sequence. Dead lawyers often improve a case, but they also make it untidy. Wolfe nodded. There, the old and new lines meet. Saul continued. Boone later did side work for a surveyor who once measured basement walls on Mercer Street. Cash job, no permit. The surveyor is dead too. New York is murder on witnesses, I said. Also on surveyors, Saul said. We had just reached the point where the room, the house, the papers, and the old omitted phrase were beginning to align when Fritz came in with the announcement that Inspector Kramer was below and in a condition of poor temper, even by his standards. Since that condition was his natural weather, the notice was mostly courtesy. Kramer arrived carrying irritation like a legal document. All right, he said to Wolfe. Talk. Wolfe lifted his brows. That is concise. You've got something. I know you have. I've got Bino stalling, Vesey sweating, Crane bargaining, and a hidden lowest chamber under Mercer Street with shelving, a desk, burned papers, and a floor trap that opens onto an older brick shaft running rearward under the property line. It's partially blocked, But it's there. I sat up. Under the property line to where? Kramer jerked a shoulder. Toward the back service strip, maybe beyond. We haven't cleared it all because half of Manhattan would need permits. Also, I found a name in one of the burned scraps. He took a folded evidence photograph from his pocket and handed it across. The scrap showed only part of a line, but enough. Boone Reese Keys. That was the kind of fragment which, in a good case, is better than a paragraph. Wolfe studied it and passed it to me, Kramer said. Who's Boone? I told him. His eyes narrowed. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you arrived only 43 seconds ago. He gave me a look, promising educational violence, and turned back to Wolfe. So this Boone was in the house years ago, worked titles, sniffed at deeds, then vanished. And now his name shows up burned in a secret chamber under the same house. That puts him in it up to his neck. No, Wolfe said. Kramer blinked. What? It puts him under it. I admit I enjoyed that one. Kramer did not. Save the jokes. I want the point. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Mister. Boone noticed that Mercer Street possessed an omitted service right, likely attached to some physical access not adequately represented in later title abstracts. He entered the house, perhaps as tenant, perhaps as caretaker, and examined the structure. He received keys. He may have discovered a route, chamber, or connection, valuable to certain enterprises. Then his name was rubbed from official records and later burned from papers stored in the secret chamber. Not because he was irrelevant, because he was dangerous to the fraud. Kramer stared at him. Fraud? Yes. Reed and his associates later built a business on that concealed asset. The staged interior, the piano, the rotating ownership, all that was camouflage and merchandising. But Boone belonged to the earlier history, the part they could not wholly invent. He had to be omitted, Kramer grunted. All right, suppose I buy that. Where is Boone now? Wolfe spread his hands slightly. If I knew, you would be even more disagreeable. Kramer turned to me. Anything else? I gave him the deed phrase and the substitution in the abstract. He listened without gratitude, which is common enough among policemen and almost refreshing in Kramer, because he never bothers to counterfeit it. When I finished, he said, so the property line on paper and the property in brick may not match. Exactly, I said. Then I'll get surveymen, Wolfe said. And meanwhile, watch Albert Bino closely. If Boone reappears in any form, living or documentary, Bino is among those most likely to panic. Kramer snorted. You think Bino knew Boone? I think Bino knows whatever the old title office once learned to ignore. That sent Kramer out with new material for his displeasure. When he was gone, I turned to Wolfe. You think Boone is dead? Yes, because of Mercer Street? Probably. And Jasper Reed? Also because of Mercer Street, but for a later reason. Reed inherited Boone's secret and made it profitable. Then someone believed Reed had become unsafe. I walked to the window, looked out at 35th Street traffic, and thought about a man in a title office who noticed a phrase disappear from a deed and followed it down into brickwork. There are easier ways to get killed in New York, but not many more educational. Behind me, Wolfe said, Archie, the significance of Walter Boone is not merely that he existed and was erased. It is that the erasure failed. It left pressure marks. Like the rubbed ledger. Yes. Like the burned scrap. Like the omitted phrase. Like the altered cellar. The structure of the fraud depends on omission. But omission is never perfect. That sounds hopeful. It is method. The telephone rang again. This time it was Ori Cather, who had been making himself useful by speaking to people who distrust police and admire confidence. I may have Leonard Don, he said. Or I had him 10 minutes ago. Bar on 9th Avenue, back room. He ducked when he saw me and left by the alley. But before he went, he told the bartender one thing worth money. He said, Boone was the only man who ever understood what the house was really for. That was enough to electrify even my coffee. I relayed it. Wolfe's lips tightened. Did he say more? He asked when I gave the message. Not to Ori. But if Leonard knows Boone by name, then the history of Mercer Street reaches further forward than we thought. Or farther backward, Wolfe said. Leonard may have heard the name from Reed, from papers, or from the chamber. In any case, Boone's significance soved in the underground history of the house. I dropped back into my chair. So now we have a missing title clerk, a hidden service right, an erased tenancy, a burned note about keys, and a pianist who says Boone understood the house. Yes, and you're not even slightly discouraged. No, why not? He took a deep breath. Because the pattern has acquired continuity. Before, we had recent fraud and recent murder. Now we know there was an older discovery, older concealment, and older motive. Mercer Street is not merely a stage set built by Reed. It is an inherited machine he exploited. Machine for what? Wolfe looked at the copied deed phrase again. Access, he said. Access disguised as pedigree, privacy disguised as architecture, history disguised as property. I stared at him. That almost answers nothing. It answers enough. He closed his eyes, which meant that while I was still wrestling with Boone, deed substitutions and hidden shafts, Wolfe had gone on ahead. I have often compared following his mind to chasing a taxi through cross traffic. You know it is on the right streets. You only don't yet know what address it has chosen. At 6 o'clock, Fritz announced dinner. During the meal, Wolfe was mostly silent, which is never a sign of emptiness with him, only of occupation at a depth where conversation would be wasteful. After dinner, he went up to the orchids and left me with my notes, my cigarette case, and Walter Boone. I spread the copies again. Walter Boone, title office, questioned the disputed deed, worked for a surveyor, occupied Mercer Street briefly, received keys, vanished, name rubbed out, name burned, no death, no forwarding, no proper ending. He had not disappeared from the house's history by accident. He had been removed from it by intention. At a little after 9, while Wolfe was still among his orchids, Saul called from a payphone. One more thing, he said. I found an old notice in a legal weekly, unpaid claim against Mercer Street occupancy damage, filed and withdrawn 11 years ago. Claimant name unreadable in the surviving copy. But the attorney who filed it was Albert Bino. That did it. When Wolfe came down, I gave him the news. He listened, sat, and folded his hands over his stomach. Then Bino is tied to Boone as well as Reed, I said. Yes, through 11 years, yes. And if Boone discovered the physical secret of the house back then, Bino knew before Reed ever turned it into a business. Yes, I leaned forward. Then maybe Bino has been the constant all along. Tull dead, Reed dead, Boone vanished, owners changed, but Bino stays in the papers. Wolfe opened his eyes. In them there was the quiet gleam that means a fact has just fitted. At last, he said softly, now we can ask not who used Mercer Street, but who preserved it, and why. Yes, the bell rang downstairs. Fritz went. A moment later he returned, and even Fritz, who believes emotional display should be taxed, looked strained. Mr. Leonard Donn, he announced. He insists on seeing you at once. He says if you do not listen tonight, there will be another death under the house. That was a sufficiently civilized way to end one phase of the case and begin the next. Chapter 5. The stare behind the wall. Leonard Donn did not look like a man who had come to save himself. He looked like a man who had delayed too long, drunk too much, and finally discovered that fear can sober a person faster than coffee and leave him in worse shape. He was thin without elegance, with dark hair gone ragged at the temples, and a face that might once have had charm, if charm had ever paid his rent. His overcoat was good cloth and bad history. His hands shook, though not from drink alone. Fritz had brought him in and withdrawn with his usual tact, which is to say he had achieved invisibility while preserving dignity. Leonard stopped just inside the office, saw Wolfe at the desk, saw me at mine, and let out a breath as if the room had at least the advantage of chairs. You're Nero Wolfe, he said. Yes, I should have come sooner. Undoubtedly. Sit down. Leonard sat in the red leather chair as if he didn't trust it. He looked at me, then back at Wolfe. If I tell you what I know, do I get the police? That depends, Wolfe said, on what you know and what you have done. I didn't kill Jasper Reed. That was not my first assumption. Your second sentence should improve upon your first. That is the kind of answer Wolfe gives when he wants a man to stop performing and start speaking. It worked. Leonard swallowed. I played there, he said, at Mercer Street. That much Clara told you, I'm sure. Reed put me there because he said the house needed a tenant who looked harmless and sounded cultivated. I was to come and go irregularly, keep no visitors except when told, and sometimes play in the afternoons or evenings, not concerts. Just enough for anyone nearby to think the place had one lonely resident and a piano. You were scenery, I said. He winced. Yes, what for? Wolfe asked. Leonard's eyes moved once toward the window, where the city was beginning to turn from grey to the electric twilight that makes New York look both richer and more guilty than it is by day. For clients, for private viewings, for atmosphere. Reed said some men would pay dearly to believe they were entering an old hidden New York house, untouched by vulgarity. There were dinners sometimes, never large, meetings, once a recital, once a card game, once a woman from Boston who wanted to buy the back parlor exactly as it stood, including the dust. Reed laughed about that for a week. So the house was a theater. Yes, but not only that. Wolfe nodded. Continue. Leonard rubbed his hands together. There was a place in it Reed cared about more than the rooms upstairs. Underneath, or behind. I don't know what to call it. He said the house had an old secret, and that was why it mattered. At first, I thought it was just one of his stories. Then one night, he took me down to the cellar, through the false wall, and showed me a chamber with shelves and a desk. Beyond that was a floor trap. He said, if I ever heard anyone in the house after midnight, and it wasn't him, I was to leave by the front door and never look back. I said, comforting employment. He paid in cash. That, in New York, explains many moral defects. Wolfe asked. Did he tell you what lay beyond the trap? No. Only that years ago a man named Boone had found it and nearly ruined everything. There it was again. Walter Boone, still alive in whispers even after 11 years, and all the rubbing out they could manage. Did you ever see Boone? Wolfe asked. Leonard shook his head. No. Reed spoke of him as if he had been a warning. He said Boone had understood the house better than anyone, and had made the mistake of thinking understanding gave him rights. That was a line to save. I wrote it down. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. When did Reed say this? 2 months ago, maybe a little more. He was drinking, but not enough to lie badly. He usually lied well, I asked. Leonard gave me a mirthless little smile. Professionally. Wolfe asked the next question without emphasis, which with him can be more dangerous than a bark. Why did you come tonight? Leonard's face changed. Whatever poor nerves and vanity and self-pity he had brought in with him, fear overrode them. Because Reed is dead and Bino knows I know there was more in that house than old wallpaper. And because I went back there yesterday before I saw Clara. I sat up. You did what? I wanted money. I thought Reed might still have hidden some there. I got in with an old key. The police had easily searched part of the cellar by then, but not all of it. I found another way. On the second floor, in the rear room, Wolfe did not move. Describe it. Leonard licked his lips. A panel behind the wall near the baseboard. There are scratches if you know where to look. Press, lift, slide. Behind it is a stair, narrow, turning down between the walls. Old timber, old brick, but cleaned, reinforced, made usable again. It leads to a lower room, smaller than the chamber under the cellar trap. No window, no fireplace, nothing. Just walls, a shelf, and a box. I was already reaching for my hat. Wolfe raised one finger without looking at me. No, Mr. Dunfer. What box? A cash box, rusted. Empty except for burned scraps and an envelope corner with Boone's name half left on it. I heard someone in the house while I was down there. I left. I think they heard me too. That was enough to make even Wolfe inhale more deeply. Who? He asked. I don't know. A man, I think. Heavy step. Not Reed, not Crane. Maybe Bino, but I can't swear it. I ran. Why conceal this from Inspector Kramer? Leonard laughed once bitterly. Because if I tell the police I knew of hidden stairs and secret rooms in a murder house, they won't offer me tea. Wolfe looked at him for a long 13 seconds. Archie, you will return to Mercer Street at once. I stood. As a buyer, I asked. Yes. The role has proven serviceable. Mr. Crane, if present, will admit you if he believes money is adjacent. You will take a flashlight and enough nerve to offend architecture. Inspect the rear room on the second floor. Verify the panel and the stair. If possible, inspect the lower room and bring back anything not nailed, provided you can do so without vulgar trespass upon Mr. Kramer's current rights. Vulgar trespass is a relative term. Then be refined. I got my coat, flashlight, and a mild opinion of civilization and headed downtown. Twilight is the best liar in New York. It softens grime, flatters brick, and makes a bad street seem one decent lamp away from character. Mercer Street at that hour looked almost plausible as the setting for a hidden life of taste and secrets. That, naturally, made me dislike it more. Milton Crane was not there. A uniformed patrolman at the door was. But patrolmen are men before they are uniforms, and if you arrive with enough certainty, enough irritation, and enough references to expected money, they sometimes conclude that delay would be more troublesome than indulgence. I gave him the Kenneth Dale routine again, added a complaint about the uncertainty surrounding the transaction, and implied that unless I inspected the rooms immediately, a certain gentleman on Park Avenue would take his cash elsewhere. The patrolman, perhaps not devoted to preserving the moral value of Mercer Street, let me in with the warning not to touch anything. I touched only what was necessary. Inside, the house felt even more staged than before. Someone had not merely furnished the idea of old domesticity. He had edited it. The chair by the grate still held its pose. The hall runner still lay with impossible discipline. The polished lamp in the upstairs back room still looked like an object in a painting rather than a life. I went straight to the second-floor rear room. Leonard had been right. Once you knew to look, the signs were there. Near the baseboard, just to the right of the bed frame, the wood bore fresh scratches, as if a shoe buckle or metal edge had brushed it recently. The wall section above it, paneled to match the rest in a competent but joyless imitation of old work, returned a slightly different sound when I rapped it with my knuckles. Not louder, hollower, a cavity disguised by habit. I knelt, found the lower edge Leonard had described, pressed and felt the resistance shift. The panel moved inward half an inch, then slid. A slice of darkness appeared. That is one of those moments a man remembers more vividly than he expects. Not because it was dramatic, though it had that in reserve, but because the house, which had been muttering through paper, plaster, brick, and lies for days, suddenly opened its mouth. Behind the fitted panel lay a narrow hidden staircase winding down between plaster and inner brick. Its bones were old. The timber treads had been cut for the space long ago, perhaps for servants, perhaps for utility access, perhaps for a vanished architectural purpose now surviving only as inconvenience. But the supports had recently been shored. The dust cleared and the rail fastened. Someone had made the old passage usable again. I clicked on the flashlight and started down. It was not a stair designed for honest daily traffic. Too narrow, too mean, too cramped for comfort. The walls pressed close enough that my shoulders nearly brushed them. The turns were sharp, the air stale. At one landing, I found a smear on the plaster that looked recent. At another, a broken match. The stair ended after perhaps 15 feet of descent at a small door latched from my side. I opened it. At the bottom was a cramped chamber with no window, no fireplace, and no purpose fit for ordinary life. It was roughly square, perhaps 7 feet by 8, with a brick floor and one shelf running along the far wall. No chair, no bed, no fittings to suggest habitation. It had the stale feeling of a room once trusted with things too dangerous to leave in daylight. My beam found a rusted cash box on the floor, lid ajar. I knelt, and opened it fully. Inside were scraps of burned paper, black-edged and brittle, some too far gone to help. One corner of an envelope, and a small brass key. The envelope fragment bore only part of a name, but enough. Boon. The rest had been singed away. I let out a breath through my teeth. So Boone had reached not only the lower chamber under the cellar, but this tighter hidden place, accessible from upstairs without touching the cellar at all. That altered the geometry of the house and nearly every theory with it. There were 2 concealed approaches at least, perhaps more. Mercer Street was not merely hiding space, it was hiding roots. I pocketed the key and one scrap of paper on which only 3 letters survived. Ease, useless by itself, and therefore probably valuable. Then I played the flashlight around the walls. No fresh opening, no shelf secret, no trap, but in the mortar near the floor on the back wall, I found a newer line where brick had been repointed in a narrow vertical strip. A seam, another alteration. Before I could decide whether to attack it with my penknife, I heard something above me. A sound on the stair, not loud. Wait, careful wait, trying not to announce itself. I shut off the flashlight at once. There is a kind of darkness in old enclosed spaces that feels physical, as if it can lean on your face. I stood still, one hand on the cash box, and listened. The weight came down 1 step, then paused. Whoever it was knew enough not to hurry. I considered 3 possibilities. 1, a patrolman doing his job. 2, a prowler with his own reasons for secrecy. 3, Inspector Kramer, which would have combined the worst features of the first 2. The latch moved. I did not wait for the door to open on me. I swung the cash box upward with my left hand and put my shoulder against the door. It hit from the other side. The box banged, somebody swore, and I drove through into the stair. In the dark we collided like bad arguments. I caught cloth, an elbow, and the sour, expensive smell of a good overcoat worn by a frightened man. He twisted free and went up fast. I followed as far as the first turn, but the staircase was too narrow for heroics and too dark for marksmanship. Not that I carried a gun for theatrical uses. By the time I reached the panel, whoever had been there was across the upstairs hall and gone. I saw only the after image of movement and heard a front door close below. I also heard the patrolman outside calling. Hey, that meant my unknown visitor had passed him or tricked him, or perhaps had official reason to be there. Not ideal. I got the panel shut, straightened my tie, put my buyer's smile back on, and went downstairs like a man offended by carpentry. The patrolman met me in the front hall. "You hear somebody?" he asked. I thought I did. This old place has enough hidden noises to qualify as a conservatory. He looked at me suspiciously, but not enough to forbid my leaving. Outside, there was no sign of the other man. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office with Leonard Don still in the red leather chair, and Saul Panzer just arriving through the front room. I gave them the report from top to bottom, including the scratches, the hollow wall, the fitted panel, the hidden stair, the lower room, the rusted cash box, the burned papers, the envelope fragment, the key, and my collision in the dark. Saul's eyes sharpened at the mention of the smell. Expensive coat and sour cologne? Not cologne. Cloth, damp, and something medicinal maybe. Leonard said instantly. Bino uses throat drops. Strong ones. Wolfe looked at him. You know this how? Because he always offered one before lying. That was neat. I handed Wolfe the key and the scrap. He turned them in his fingers as if weighing not the objects but their implications. To concealed routes, he said. One through the cellar, one through the second-floor wall. Perhaps linked, perhaps not. The upper route allows descent without entering the cellar at all. The lower chamber, accessible by stair, holds burned papers and Boone's name. Therefore, Boone's knowledge touched the upper concealment, not merely the cellar chamber Mr. Kramer found. And the room wasn't for living, I said. No window, no fire, no furniture. It was for hiding objects, papers, or a person briefly. Nothing else, yes. Leonard swallowed, Reed once said the house had more than one memory. Wolfe turned his head. When? Drunk again, he said. Old houses kept the habits of the people who had used them, and clever men could make money by learning which habits were worth preserving. That man deserved poisoning on grounds of rhetoric alone, I said. Wolfe ignored me. Archie, The vertical seam in the lower room. Did it align with the rear of the house? Roughly. Then another route may exist beyond it, perhaps formally leading to the appurtenant service, right omitted from the deed, Saul said. And Bino or someone like him returned tonight because he knew of the upper stair too. That was the blood in it. Whoever had been on the stair after me had not been browsing. He had come because Leonard's panic or Reed's death or Kramer's excavation had made some hidden thing urgent. A frightened man does not revisit a murder house at twilight unless there is still something there he wants, fears, or believes others have missed. Wolfe looked at Leonard Don for a long moment. Did Reed ever mention Walter Boone as dead? Leonard blinked. No, only as gone. Interesting, Wolfe said softly. I pounced. You think Boone may have lived longer than we thought. I think Reed found it useful to preserve ambiguity. A dead man closes certain lines of leverage. A vanished man leaves room for invention, fear, and blackmail. Saul nodded. If Boone discovered the true property irregularity and Bino managed to suppress it, Boone's continued uncertainty would be useful to anyone profiting from the place later. Wolfe set the burned scrap on the desk. Exactly. The room behind the wall confirms 3 things. First, Mercer Street was altered to create controlled secret movement between visible and invisible sections. Second, the concealed uses predate Reed's theatrical business and were later adapted to it. Third, someone is still trying to erase, recover, or verify whatever Boone left behind. I lit a cigarette. That room felt trusted once. Wolfe's eyes moved to me. Explain. It had no comforts and no function for ordinary life, but it didn't feel random either. It felt like a place people had relied on, a place for papers or money or waiting. The stale feeling was not abandonment. It was repetition. He grunted approval. Good, Leonard said in a low voice. Reed hid money in the house sometimes. Not much. And Vaux papers. Where? Wolfe asked. I never saw. I think not always the same place. Once he came upstairs from the rear room looking pleased with himself. That gave fresh value to the upper stair. Reed had not merely inherited Mercer Street's secret spaces. He had used them actively, perhaps to store documents, payments, or leverage. If so, his killer might have come not only to poison him, but to retrieve or destroy something afterward. Wolfe asked Leonard. Did Reed fear Bino? Leonard looked miserable. Yes, but he also thought Bino needed him. Lately, he said that had changed. How? He thought he had found the original bite of it. Those were his words. Something older than the recent ownership scheme. He said if Bino tried to cheat him, he could tear the whole thing open. I whistled. Then Reed didn't just manage the house. He found Boone's old trail. Probably, Wolfe said, and got himself killed for it. Possibly. Or believed he could not be killed because what he knew protected him. Vanity is often terminal. Saul rose. I'll dig at Bino tonight. Do so, Wolfe said. Also, any surviving associate of Maurice Tull who handled old Mercer Street files. When Saul had gone, Leonard Don looked smaller in the red leather chair than when he had entered. Fear takes space away from a man. So does the realization that he has come into the only room in New York where the truth will be demanded entire. Wolfe gave him that truth room stare. You are withholding something. Leonard's fingers tightened on the chair arms. Only because I'm not sure it matters. It does. He closed his eyes briefly. The night before Reed died, I heard him arguing in the dining room with someone. I was upstairs. I only caught bits. Reed said, Boone never signed it. And the other man said, that is exactly why it can be corrected. I felt it hit before I understood it. Wolfe did, too. His eyes opened wider by a fraction. A signature, he said. Leonard nodded miserably. That's all I'd know. It was enough. In a case built from altered walls, omitted deed phrases, rubbed ledger names, and hidden passages, a missing or forged signature was not a side dish. It was the meat. Wolfe leaned back, shut his eyes, and took one of his deep tidal breaths. The stair behind the wall, he murmured, was not made merely to hide movement. It hid custody. Custody of what? I asked. Of paper, he said. Of title. of the one thing more dangerous than a man in a hidden room, and that is a document in the wrong hands. He opened his eyes and looked at me. There was now a brightness there, which meant the case had ceased to be a maze and become instead a machine with parts beginning to lock. "Archie," he said, "tomorrow we stop examining Mercer Street as architecture and start examining it as an argument. That may sound abstract, but when Nero Wolfe says a house is making an argument, somebody is very likely to be arrested before long." Chapter 6. The deed that lied for years. When Nero Wolfe has enough facts to become dangerous, the brownstone acquires a different atmosphere. The office grows quieter, not because less is said, but because every word begins to cost more. Even the traffic on 35th Street seems, by comparison, a vulgar and unnecessary improvisation. The morning after Leonard Donne told us Reed had quarreled over a signature, Wolfe ate breakfast with unusual attention and said almost nothing. That meant the case had passed from collection to arrangement. Fritz brought kidneys with care, coffee with authority, and hot rolls with the serene confidence of a man who knows that if civilization collapses, it will not be for failure of his kitchen. I took what comfort I could from the coffee and tried not to look eager, which is difficult when one lives with a genius who has just begun to enjoy himself. At 9:30 Wolfe entered the office, settled behind his desk, and spread before him the relics Mercer Street had yielded up grudgingly. Copied deeds, title abstracts, municipal notations, repair invoices, the fragment of envelope bearing Boone's name, the scorched scrap with 3 surviving letters, and the small brass key I had brought from the room behind the wall. The whole collection would have looked unimpressive to any citizen not in the habit of detecting murder. To Wolfe it was an orchestra tuning. He sat there for a full minute with his eyes half shut. Then he said, "Archie, the burned papers gave us enough. That's heartening. Enough for what? For truth, if properly arranged. Also for trouble." I had counted on both. He put one finger on the oldest deed copy. "Let us review, but accurately. The house on Mercer Street possessed, in an early description, certain rear service rights appurtenant to it." That phrase later disappeared from the abstracted chain. Walter Boone, working in a title office, noticed the omission and considered it significant because the physical structure still suggested a dependent access not reflected in modern paper. Right. He later occupied the house briefly. During or before that period, he received keys to some concealed area, perhaps to inspect, perhaps to guard, perhaps because he had become inconvenient and needed management. His name was then rubbed from ledgers, his existence softened, his connection obscured, and later burned from papers in the lower room. Yes. Wolfe lifted the envelope fragment. "Not wholly successfully," I said, and Jasper Reed found Boone's trail. More than that, Reed discovered the same truth Boone had found years earlier. He may not have understood it at first, but he understood enough. He turned it into leverage. He leaned back. Reed did not build a business on hidden rooms alone. Hidden rooms are useful, but they do not produce repeated transfers, frightened shell owners, and murder. No, he built his business on a title lie that had been aging for years. That deserved silence for a moment. I gave it one. The front bell rang. "Fritz," admitted Saul Panzer, who had exactly the look he wears when he has found something substantial and is too disciplined to preen over it. He sat, crossed one ankle over a knee, and handed me 2 folded sheets. One was a copied memorandum from a title office. The other was an old carbon of correspondence from a dead lawyer's files. Saul said, "I got lucky. Or rather, someone else was sloppy 12 years ago and the sloppiness outlived him." Maurice Toole kept private notes, not many. One was filed under a land dispute that had nothing to do with Mercer Street on its face. It mentions Boone indirectly. It also mentions an uncorrected conveyance irregularity and says the matter should be managed by retention of practical possession until documentary harmony is achieved. I whistled. That sounds like a lawyer describing theft in church clothes. Wolfe nodded. "Read the rest." I did. The note was brief, cautious, and oily. It referred to a prior transfer whose execution had not been completed to effective standard, but which had nonetheless been entered into practice for commercial purposes. A later hand in pencil had added the words, Boone, inquisitive. Removed from file view, I looked up. There's your wet cloth. Yes, Wolfe said. The deed that lied, Saul continued. There's more. I found an old clerk from the title office, retired in Yonkers, and sour about his pension. He remembered Boone because Boone had a bad habit of asking why copied abstracts didn't always match original descriptions. The clerk said, Boone once insisted a Mercer Street transfer was void because one of the signatures had been witnessed but never properly acknowledged. I felt the room shift. Not acknowledged, I said. Not properly, Saul repeated. According to the clerk, Boone believed the property had not truly changed hands in the legal sense at all. The paper pretended ownership had shifted, but the underlying conveyance was defective. No court had ruled. No one wanted one to. Wolfe exhaled deeply, as if a door in his mind had just opened inward. There, I stared at him. That's it? It is the core. Years earlier, the Mercer Street house became part of a quiet scheme involving forged or defective transfers, hidden documents, and men who preferred ownership to remain ambiguous when profit required it. If the original transfer failed in execution, all subsequent transfers built on it were masks. Profitable masks, but masks. I got up and walked to the globe, not because it helped, but because motion was easier than sitting still while the case rearranged itself. Then Boone discovered that the chain was false from the beginning. Yes, and Reed later discovered the same thing. Yes, and if Reed knew the sales were paper theater built over an older, defective deed, he could frighten every later participant. Exactly. I turned back. Then Reed had not been selling property. Wolfe's eyes rested on me, pleased by one fraction. He had been managing panic dressed up as real estate. That sentence sat down in the room and stayed there. I went back to my chair. All right, let's make it plain enough for me. There was an older bad transfer. Maybe forged, maybe defectively executed, maybe both. Boone found that the title didn't legally pass the way later papers claimed. The hidden spaces in the house were where the proof was kept or controlled. Partly. Then Tull and later Bino decided not to correct the defect honestly. Certainly not. Honest correction would expose prior fraud, invalidate later claims, and threaten whoever had profited meanwhile. So instead they managed possession. Yes, that was Tull's phrase. Retention of practical possession. Not lawful ownership, but actual control of the premises and of the documents. Enough to keep the game operating. Saul said, and enough to make the house useful as a place for private transactions precisely because the title was murky. Ambiguous ownership can be a disease, but it can also be a no respectable tenant, no normal family, no one who asks questions. Instead, the place gets used by arrangement, by favor, by temporary paper ownership, by shells and frightened nominees. Wolfe grunted. Until Reed improves the concept. That was the next step. Jasper Reed had not originated Mercer Street's corruption. He had inherited it. But he had done what lively mediocrities sometimes do when they stumble onto old vice with commercial potential. He had modernized it, I said. He discovers the title defect, or enough of it, through Boone's traces, or through the documents in the hidden rooms. He realizes every recent transfer is a mask over an older fraud. Then, instead of blowing the whistle, he monetizes the uncertainty. Yes. How? Wolfe spread his fingers. By supplying silence. By controlling access, preserving the illusion of lawful occupancy, arranging nominal owners, and offering private use to persons whose own affairs benefited from discretion. The staged domesticity, the piano, the controlled atmosphere, the shell transfers, all of that softened the essential truth. Mercer Street was not a house being sold. It was a legal wound being dressed repeatedly and charged by the hour. I admired that and wrote it down. Saul said, Horace Van wasn't buying a house. He was paying for access to something that looked like inherited privacy. Or to a version of it, Wolfe said. I added. And if clients learned the title was rotten, some might run, some might sue, some might become vulnerable. Reed could charge them for continued confidence. Precisely. The telephone rang, I answered. It was Fred Durkin, who had gone to the surrogate archives, because Wolfe wanted every dead hand in the Mercer Street chain accounted for, Fred said. I found the original transfer from the estate. Or rather, I found the execution page. One signature is doubtful and the acknowledgement certificate on the attached copy was replaced, different paper stock. That was enough to bring me fully upright. Can you prove it? Not in court by phone. But the page does not belong to the rest of the instrument. And there's a notation on the docket, suggesting the filing was delayed, then corrected. Bring it. When I relayed it, Wolfe shut his eyes. Yes, he murmured, the deed that lied for years. It is hard to explain how maddening Nero Wolfe can be at such moments. He had the answer in shape, if not in every contour, but he did not hurry to unfold it. He let it thicken. I have seen him do the same with sources, orchids, and suspects. At 11:20, Inspector Kramer arrived without being invited, which, in his case, is less a social error than a vocation. He entered with his hat in one hand, and a face announcing that the police department was not getting full value from the known world. All right, he said. I've got Bino saying nothing, Vesey saying too much. Bargaining for sainthood, and no patience left. What have you got? Wolfe regarded him. A defective conveyance. Kramer frowned. English. A bad deed, an old one. Possibly forged in part, certainly improperly completed, later papered over. Mercer Street has been passing from hand to hand without truly changing hands at all. Kramer blinked once, hard. You're saying every sale is no good. I am saying every recent sale rests on a prior transfer that may have failed legally. If so, the chain is compromised. Mr. Boone noticed this years ago. Mr. Reed later noticed it as well. I took over, since Kramer likes his explanations with fewer subordinate clauses. Think of it this way. Suppose a man sells you a house he never properly bought. You put on fresh paper, maybe a shell corporation, maybe a nominee, then another sale, then another. On paper it looks active. In law it may still be diseased from the first bad step. Boone found the rot. Reed turned it into a racket. Kramer glared at us both. What racket? Wolfe answered. Managing the fears of all persons touched by that rotten chain. Temporary owners, lawyers, brokers, private users, wealthy clients. Reed could threaten exposure or imply protection. He could also offer the house itself as controlled, plausible, atmospheric privacy while never surrendering the underlying secret. Kramer's jaw worked. Blackmail. Not necessarily explicit, more elegant. He sold silence. Through real estate. Kramer snorted. That is filthy enough to be true. Can you prove the deed is bad? Soon. Fred arrived 10 minutes later with the copy. We spread it on Wolfe's desk. Even to my notarially untrained eye, the execution page looked wrong once it was compared closely. The stock, the edge trim, the tint, all just off enough to be irritating. The acknowledgement seal impression was weak, where the rest of the paper was crisp. More to the point. The signature line for one transferring party bore a name with the lifeless look of handwriting, drawn from memory rather than from the wrist of a living person. Kramer bent over it. This would need an expert. Yes, Wolfe said, and a court eventually. But not for our immediate purpose. We require motive, not quiet title, I said. Boone found this or something like it. Tull and Bino knew enough to suppress it. They kept practical possession of the house and concealed the hidden documentation. Later Reed found the same truth and discovered he could profit from everyone's fear that the old fraud might surface. Kramer straightened, including Bino. Especially Bino, Wolfe said. That brought us to the murder. Once the title defect was central, Reed's death changed color. Before, he had looked like a broker who knew too much about hidden rooms. Now he was a broker who had discovered that the entire Mercer Street enterprise rested on an old legal lie, one dangerous enough to expose years of false transfers and anyone who had earned money from them, I said. If Reed had the proof, or enough of it, he could squeeze Bino, scare the shell owners, and keep clients obedient. Or, Kramer said, one of those clients might kill him to avoid being exposed. Possible, Wolfe said, but less likely. Reed was poisoned in the house, in a setting he trusted, by someone who knew the old structure of dependency. This suggests not a panicked outsider, but a participant in the long management of Mercer Street. Kramer grunted. Bino, probably, or someone acting for him. Yet there remains the missing or disputed signature. Reed quarreled over it. Mr. Dunn heard the words. I told Kramer what Leonard had reported. Boone never signed it. That is exactly why it can be corrected. Kramer's eyes narrowed. Corrected? After all these years? Wolfe nodded. In Criminal Minds, yes. If Boone never properly signed or acknowledged a necessary paper, then Boone's disappearance left a gap. That gap might later be cured by forgery, substitution, or fabricated correction, provided one controlled enough of the documentary environment. Kramer stared. You think Reed had found that they were about to patch the old defect, or had already attempted to? Then he threatened to stop it, or to profit from it, Wolfe said. Reed was not a martyr. He was an entrepreneur with bad ethics and worse caution. That gave Kramer no pleasure at all. He likes a corpse morally straightforward if he can get one. When he left, muttering about handwriting experts and warrants, Wolfe told me to get Leonard Dunn back in. Leonard had gone to one of Saul's safe arrangements the night before, which meant a hotel whose management preferred cash and ignorance. I phoned, and by 2 o'clock he was in the office again, haggard but sober enough to hurt. Wolfe fixed him with a look that would have made a bishop confess to petty theft. You told us, Reed said. Boone never signed it. Yes. What else? Leonard hesitated. I could see him performing the useless calculation common to weak men facing Wolfe. How much truth can be spared and still count as cooperation? The answer is always none, Reed said. Leonard began. That Bino thought old paper could be remade if old people were gone. Reed laughed and said Boone had been more trouble missing than he would have been alive. Then Bino said something about a duplicate custody sheet and a witness no longer breathing. Wolfe's lips tightened. When was this? The night before Reed died. Where? In the dining room. I was upstairs in the front room, but the house carries voices when it wants to. That was worth gold and possibly handcuffs. I wrote it down carefully. Wolfe asked. Had Reed been drinking? Yes. Had Bino? He sounded tired, not drunk. Did Reed seem afraid? Leonard thought about it. No, angry. Pleased too, in a mean way. As if he finally had something Bino couldn't smooth over. Wolfe nodded. Good. Leave nothing else out. Leonard looked at his hands. There is something else. Reed once showed me a folded paper and said, if he ever vanished, the city would discover Mercer Street had belonged for years to no one who dared claim it properly. I thought he was bragging. Maybe he was. Did he say where the paper was kept? No. That sent me mentally through the hidden chamber, the upper stair room, the cellar passage, the false wall, the repointed seam. Mercer Street had become an anatomy of concealment. There might still be one organ we had not reached. After Leonard left, Wolfe dictated me 2 letters, both designed to flush paper from hiding. One summoned Albert Bino for 6 o'clock on this explicit statement that Wolfe had identified the original conveyance defect and the likely motive for Jasper Reed's murder. The other summoned Edwin Vesey and Milton Crane at the same hour. Wolfe does not often cast a net without knowing which fish he expects, but he likes the others present to see themselves in it. Until then, there was work to do. I spent the afternoon assembling the sequence as Wolfe wanted it, stripped of all romance and all broker's varnish. Years earlier, Mercer Street entered a dubious transfer. A deed or execution page was forged, defectively acknowledged, or otherwise invalid. Maurice Toole, and likely Albert Bino after him, chose concealment over correction. The house remained under practical control rather than lawful clarity. Walter Boone, from a title office, noticed the defect, and connected it to the physical house, perhaps because hidden papers or access rights made the discrepancy more than theoretical. Boone was neutralized, omitted, and perhaps killed. Years later, Jasper Reed discovered the same truth. Instead of exposing it, he turned it into a business. By rotating nominal owners, staging the house as a cultivated secret, controlling hidden rooms and access points, and offering private use to wealthy or vulnerable clients, he sold not property but managed ambiguity. He could also extort, imply protection, or threaten disclosure. When he overreached, he died. When I read it back to Wolfe, he corrected only one phrase. Not extort. He said that is too vulgar. Say he converted legal uncertainty into personal dependency, which is more accurate and less good for headlines. Headlines are Lon Cohen's disease. At 6, the visitors began to arrive. Milton Crane came first, polished and wary, and already regretting every profession he had ever sampled. Edwin Vesey followed, nervous in a brown suit that wanted to be respectable and never quite made it. Albert Bino came last, and entered with deliberate calm, which is what frightened men wear when they believe collapse is a kind of discourtesy. The office had acquired that charged stillness it gets before Wolfe starts tightening threads. I was at my desk. Saul stood near the bookcase. Leonard Donne had been placed in the front room for later use. Fritz had served coffee and withdrawn. Wolfe sat massive and expressionless, one hand on the arm of his chair. "Gentlemen," he said, "Mercer Street has lied for years. Mr. Reed died because he learned how." Crane shifted. Vesey swallowed. Bino merely looked bored, which in him was effort. Wolfe continued. The house did not truly change hands in the legal sense after the original defective conveyance. Walter Boone noticed that. Jasper Reed noticed it later. Boone seems to have disappeared. Reed began to profit from the concealment. Vesey burst first. "I didn't know details. Bino handled paper. Reed handled use." "Be quiet," Bino said without looking at him. Wolfe lifted a finger. "Mr. Vesey said something useful. Mr. Bino did handle paper. Mr. Reed handled use. The arrangement was profitable until Reed found evidence that the old defect could not be cured without exposing prior fraud." Bino spoke then, his voice level. "This is conjecture." "No," Wolfe said. "It is structure. The forged or replaced execution page. The omitted appurtenant rights, Boone's rubbed name, the burned papers, the hidden custody rooms. Reed's argument over Boone's missing signature. Shall I continue?" For the first time, Bino's face altered. "Only slightly, but enough." Crane said quickly. "I never saw any deed." "No," Wolfe said. "You saw rooms. Mr. Vesey saw materials. Mr. Bino saw leverage." Vesey turned on Bino. "You said it was ancient paper nobody would ever reopen." Bino's head moved an inch. "Do not be a fool. You made us all owners of nothing." "Nominal holders," Bino said sharply. "Protected holders." Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "Ah, protected from what?" No one answered. Then Wolfe did what he does best. He laid it out piece by piece, like setting broken teeth back into a jaw. The original transfer from the estate was bad. Either one signer never properly executed it, or a replacement page later supplied the appearance of regularity. Tull knew. Boone learned. Boone also learned that documentary evidence, or corroborating custody records, were kept in, or connected to hidden parts of the house. Boone became dangerous, and was removed, first from files, then from history. Bino inherited or acquired Tull's role as custodian of the fraud. For years the house remained in controlled ambiguity. Then Reed entered. Reed discovered enough to realize that Mercer Street's value lay not in market price, but in the fear of anyone whose interests touched the concealed defect. He preserved the house, staged it, rotated ownership, used Leonard Donne and the piano to humanize it, sold private access to clients, and monetized silence. He was not marketing property. He was managing panic dressed up as real estate. When Wolfe stopped, no one in the room seemed eager to disturb the air. Then Bino said, "Suppose I accept, only for argument, that there was some old irregularity. That proves at most a motive for pressure. Not murder." Wolfe nodded. "Certainly. The murder required an additional event. Reed discovered, very recently, that you intended to repair the old defect fraudulently, perhaps by manufacturing a corrective document based on Boone's absence. Reed realized this would cut him out or render his leverage worthless. He confronted you. He threatened exposure. You poisoned him. Crane made a strangled sound. Vesey shut his eyes. Bino remained very still. That is fantasy, he said. Wolfe shook his head. No, it is the only line that explains urgency. If Reed merely continued profiting from the old uncertainty, he lived. If he discovered you were about to eliminate that uncertainty by a fresh fraud, using the dead or vanished Boone, then he became intolerable. I opened the office door and brought Leonard Don in. He looked at Bino and flinched. Good. Truth often likes a visible fear, Wolfe said. Mr. Dunn heard enough of your argument to preserve the crucial line. Boone never signed it. That is exactly why it can be corrected. Bino turned his head and looked at Leonard with a dryness that had no life in it. A drunken pianist. Yet sober enough to remember your words, Wolfe said. At that moment the bell rang downstairs. Fritz admitted Inspector Kramer, who entered with pearly Stebbins, and the broad satisfaction of a man who has been told to come at exactly the right minute and knows someone else is about to do his work for him, Kramer said. You done? Almost, Wolfe told him. Mr. Bino poisoned Jasper Reed because Reed discovered the renewed document fraud and threatened his command of Mercer Street. Search Bino's office for draft corrective instruments, replacement acknowledgement forms, and any surviving custody sheet linked to Walter Boone. Kramer looked at Bino. We already did, 10 minutes ago. Guess what we found? That was excellent police timing, and I admired it without generosity. Pearlie produced a folder. Inside, among other things, was a half-completed instrument reciting a confirmatory transfer tied to the old Mercer Street conveyance, with blank spaces for signatures and one attached notarial form prepared for substitution. There was also, inside, a custody note referring to Boone by full name. Bino's face did not crumble. Men like him do not crumble in public. They calcify. Kramer stepped forward. Albert Bino, you're under arrest for the murder of Jasper Reed and a few paper tricks besides. Bino drew one breath. Then he said, Reed was a blackmailer. Wolfe snorted. Naturally. But your complaint is posthumous. Kramer took him. When they had gone, along with Crane, Vesey, Pearlie, and enough tension to re-roof the house, I sat down and let the case settle. Boone, I said. Wolfe nodded. Yes, his end remains uncertain, though I suspect we shall learn it. But Reed's business is clear. Clear enough. He sold silence to those who feared exposure. Yes. I looked toward the window, where night had fully reached the street, and the city making its usual racket of appetite and invention. A house with a bad deed and a hidden stare. New York earns its reputation. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and took a deep, satisfied breath. Not the house, Archie. The men. The house merely remembered. That ended the major part of the case, though not all of it. There was still Boone's final fate. The physical route beneath Mercer Street, and the gathering Wolfe would inevitably require, in order to satisfy both his vanity and the universe. But the central lie had yielded. The deed had lied for years. Jasper Reed had found out, and instead of curing the disease, he had opened a practice in it. Chapter 7. The dining room was only the stage. By the time Nero Wolfe was ready to assemble Mercer Street in human form, the weather had turned damp and the city had acquired that washed, metallic look New York gets when the sky seems to have been pawned and the receipt misplaced. Inside the brownstone, however, things were in their proper order. The office was warm, the curtains drawn against evening, the lamp on Wolfe's desk making a yellow pool over papers, now neat enough to suggest innocence, and the chairs arranged with that deceptive civility which in our house often means someone's safety is about to be removed word by word. Wolfe had a genius for gatherings, not for their mechanics. If left to himself, he would have preferred the guilty to present themselves by instinct, announce their crimes alphabetically, and go away. But for the shaping of a room, the order of revelation, The exact moment when a man's face should be obliged to betray him, he had no equal. He could make a parlor feel like a courtroom, and a courtroom feel like a trap. At a little after 6, the first arrival was Inspector Kramer, who never liked being summoned, and liked even less admitting that he had come, because Wolfe had something he wanted. He entered scowling, set his hat on the red leather chair, saw there were not enough chairs to suit his temper, and then looked at me. If this is another one of those performances where he says 2 words, stares at the ceiling, and expects me to clap on handcuffs, I'll drag you in too. You should be grateful, I told him. Tickets for this would cost money in a less educated city. He grunted and sat where I indicated, near enough the desk to object efficient, and far enough from the door that no one could use him as an exit. The second arrival was Milton Crane. His polish had cracked since our first meeting. He was still correctly dressed, still neat, still carrying himself with the fragile vanity of a man who has sold cultivated surfaces for so long he has come to think smoothness is character. But he no longer looked as if a commission might save him. He looked as if any sentence spoken near him might be sworn testimony. He tried a smile on me. It died on the way. I have come voluntarily, he said. That is a charming legal instinct, I told him. Sit down. After him came Ruth Keller. That name had taken us a day to get. She was the supposed last owner, or one of the many nominal owners Mercer Street had worn like borrowed hats. And if you had asked me, before I met her, what a woman looked like who had signed papers she barely understood, I would have said she looked like half the city after tax season. Ruth Keller looked worse. She was perhaps 40, fair-haired with too much care wasted on appearing composed, and in the grip of the kind of fear that does not make a person dramatic. It makes her quieter than she can bear. She paused in the doorway as though the room itself might accuse her. Mrs. Keller, I said, pulling out a chair. Miss, she corrected faintly. I was married once. Then you know enough about documentants to have avoided some of them, I said. She gave me one startled glance, then sat and folded her hands in her lap so tightly that even from my desk I could see the knuckles whiten. Edwin Vesey arrived next, sweating through respectability. Leonard Donne followed under Saul Panzer's escort, and took the chair I had left for him near the front room door. Clara Donne came too, because Wolfe had decided that whatever remained to be said about her brother and Jasper Reed should be said where she could hear it, and stop inventing worse possibilities. Saul himself stayed by the bookcase. Pearlie Stebbins took the wall opposite him and looked like a large man who had accepted furniture as an occupational hazard. Albert Bino was absent, naturally. He had already been supplied to the law, but his absence sat in the room as distinctly as any chair. When all were placed, Wolfe came in from the hall, crossed to his desk, and lowered himself into his chair with the deliberate finality of a judge taking the bench in a court where the defendant has already had every chance to flee. He looked from face to face without hurry. The matter of Mercer Street, he said, is nearly complete. There remain certain clarities to provide, 1 or 2 errors to correct, and perhaps some relief for innocent persons who have behaved foolishly. Ruth Keller made a small sound at the word innocent, as if she did not trust herself to claim it even indirectly. Kramer snorted. Get on with it. Wolfe inclined his head one fraction. The house on Mercer Street has been discussed too often as if it were the principal object in question. It is not. The house was useful because it could be made to seem empty, old, respectable, and final. Those qualities are theatrically valuable. But the true matter was always beneath, behind, and before it. Beneath, because concealed spaces and passages preserved access and custody. Behind, because erased records and omitted rights concealed a false title history. Before it, because men like Jasper Reed and Albert Bino stood in front of the structure and sold others a lie about what it was. Milton Crane swallowed. Wolfe continued. The dining room was where Jasper Reed died, but not where the real crime began. That room had been chosen because it looked empty, respectable, and final, while the true heart of the matter remained buried behind the walls. That landed exactly as he intended. People shifted. Even Clara Donn, who had heard much of this already, looked toward the floor as if Mercer Street might at that moment be under it. Kramer said, "All right, from the top." Wolfe nodded. Years ago, the Mercer Street property passed through a conveyance that was defective. The fault may have been a forged execution, an invalid acknowledgement, or a substitution in the filed page. But the legal effect was the same. The property did not truly change hands in the way later abstracts claimed. Nevertheless, certain lawyers and associated men found ambiguity more profitable than correction. The older pertinent rear service rights were omitted from later descriptions. Control of the house was maintained through practical possession rather than clear lawful title. Hidden documentary custody seems to have been preserved in parts of the house itself. Ruth Keller blinked and looked helplessly at me. I gave her nothing. She had come to hear, not to be comforted. Wolfe went on. Walter Boone, who worked in a title office, noticed the discrepancy. He then appears in the history of the house as an occupant or caretaker for less than a year. His name was later rubbed almost clean from utility and municipal records. He was not forgotten. He was removed. Leonard Donn lowered his head. Milton Crane broke in. "I never knew Boone." Wolfe turned his eyes on him. "I had not yet accused you of longevity, Mr. Crane." "Be silent." Crane obeyed with poor grace. Wolfe lifted one of the copied ledgers. "Boone's erased tenancy matters because it reveals two things. First, the old fraud had already been discovered once. Second, those managing the house preferred omission to resolution. Boone either disappeared or was disposed of. In either event, his knowledge lingered in hidden papers, altered plans, and the very carpentry of the building." Purley shifted at that. He had spent enough hours under Mercer Street by then to know carpentry can be a form of perjury. Wolfe placed the ledger aside. Years later, Jasper Reed discovered enough of the same truth to realize the house was more valuable as a controlled uncertainty than as ordinary property. He did not expose the fraud. He converted it into a business. Edwin Vesey flinched. Ruth Keller's lips parted. Wolfe looked at Vesey. "You supplied materials and old fittings, Mr. Crane. Supplied manner and market language. Others supplied shell ownership. Reed supplied invention." Crane burst out. "I showed rooms. That is all. I was told the legal side was protected." "By Albert Bino," I said. Crane turned on me. "Yes, by Bino." Wolfe lifted a hand. Reed's improvement of the enterprise was elegant in its corruption. He staged Mercer Street not as a house to live in, but as a house to be believed. Selective repairs, isolated decorative care, carefully false domestic traces, a piano to humanize the structure and soften suspicious sounds, temporary nominal owners, too timid or too needy to ask the right questions. He marketed old New York compressed into private use. Yet what he truly sold was silence. He looked toward Ruth Keller then, and his voice, while not soft, altered enough to spare her without lying to her. "Miss Keller, you signed purchase papers because you were told it would be a temporary accommodation, a paper holding, and that your risk was negligible." She nodded too quickly. "Mr. Bino said it was a tax matter only. He said the title office had delayed some routine correction, and my name would stand for a short interval. I was paid." "How much?" Kramer barked. She twisted her hands. $2,000. Milton Crane stared at her, perhaps offended that fear could be purchased so modestly. Wolfe said, "You did not occupy the house." "No." "You did not inspect it thoroughly." "No, Mr. Crane met me there once. He showed me the front room and said the place was being prepared for eventual restoration. I was not to concern myself with practical details." "That," I said, "was wise of him, because practical details often develop teeth." Kramer shot me a look that asked for less wit and more facts. Since Wolfe had both in better proportion, I yielded the floor. "Miss Keller," Wolfe said, "did Jasper Reed ever speak to you privately?" She hesitated. Then she said, "Once. He told me I need not be afraid if I kept my mouth shut and signed where Mr. Bino instructed." Did he ask for more money? No. Did he mention Walter Boone? No. Wolfe nodded. Very well. He turned to Kramer. Her importance is not criminal. It is structural. She proves. The late ownership sequence continued Reed's practice of interposing frightened nominal holders between the fraudulent title history and the house's practical use. Kramer grunted. I know what she proves. Get to the poison. Soon. But one more correction first. Wolfe shifted his gaze to Milton Crane. Mr. Crane, you have represented yourself as a mere seller of rooms. That is false. You understood enough to preserve the atmosphere of lawful neglect. You knew the house was being arranged, not abandoned. You admitted prospective buyers with too much readiness because an interested stranger was less useful to you than a credulous one. You allowed the stage details to stand because they created belief. Crane's face sharpened. Belief is the whole business of property. No, Wolfe said. In your case it was the business of fraud. That shut him. Wolfe took up the next thread. Jasper Reed learned, shortly before his death, that the old defect in the Mercer Street chain was not merely exploitable, but perhaps repairable by a fresh fraud. He found evidence, or enough of it, that Albert Bino intended to produce corrective paper based on Boone's absence and on the disappearance of witnesses long dead. Reed understood at once that if Bino succeeded, Reed's leverage vanished. The entire business depended on managed uncertainty. Remove the uncertainty, and Reed becomes disposable. Clarendon went pale. Leonard looked as though he had swallowed a blade. Wolfe did not pause. Reed, therefore, quarreled with Bino. Leonard Don heard enough of that quarrel to preserve the crucial line. Boone never signed it. That is exactly why it can be corrected. That statement is grotesque in law and illuminating in crime. It means Bino believed Boone's disappearance made forgery easier than truth. Reed, however corrupt, recognized that such a correction would exclude him from the profits or expose him to ruin. He threatened, directly or indirectly, to tear open the old fraud. Kramer leaned forward, and Bino poisoned him. Yes, Vesey let out a miserable breath. I never knew it would come to that. No, Wolfe said. You only helped maintain a stage on which it could. The room had grown very still. Outside, the street reached us faintly, as if us were merely houses, and people signed deeds, for reasons too dull to support homicide. Wolfe folded his hands. Now, why the dining room? Kramer snorted. Because that's where the body was. Not enough. Many rooms would have served. The dining room was chosen because it looked empty, respectable, and final. Reed was laid there beneath the ceiling fixture, in a room from which overt domestic evidence had been removed. That setting flattered accident and concealment at once. An empty dining room in an old house implies closure. A hidden stair or a narrow chamber behind a wall implies continuation. The killer wanted closure displayed and continuation hidden. Ruth Keller whispered. I don't understand, I answered, since sometimes a plain voice helps. Whoever killed Reed wanted the visible part of the house to tell one story. Empty place, dead broker, maybe a bad deal, maybe poison, maybe private business gone wrong. But the real story lived in the concealed parts, with the papers, the old defect, Boone's traces, and the passages. The dining room was only the front page. She stared at me, then nodded slowly, as if a bad dream had agreed to become grammar. Wolfe resumed. Archie, the upper stair, that was my cue. I got up and described it for the room. The fresh scratches near the baseboard in the second-floor rear room. The hollow wall section. The fitted panel. The narrow hidden staircase winding down between plaster and inner brick. The cramped lower chamber with no human use fit for ordinary life. The rusted cash box, burned scraps, envelope fragment bearing Boone's name, and the sense that the room had long been trusted with things too dangerous to leave in daylight. When I was done, Kramer nodded once, despite himself. He had by then seen enough of Mercer Street's understructure to dislike it personally. Wolfe said, That stare is critical because it demonstrates design layered over time. The concealed spaces predated Reed's business, but were revived, repaired, and integrated into it. Isolated structural improvements made under separate, nominal owners were not random maintenance. They were pieces of a hidden design completed by several hands ignorant of the whole, or afraid to know it. He looked at Vesey. "You reinforced old appearances," Vesey muttered. "Reed said the clients wanted authenticity. Clients wanted secrecy draped in authenticity," Wolfe snapped. "Do not flatter yourself with aesthetics." Then turned to Leonard Donne. "And you supplied sound. Scales in the afternoons, fragments in the evening. Enough to make neighbors believe in one harmless tenant, and enough to blur lesser noises in the fabric of the house." Leonard's voice was low. "Yes." Clara made a broken little movement toward him. "Not accusation exactly. Not forgiveness either," Wolfe continued. "Reed thus transformed Mercer Street into a machine of credibility. Old rooms above, hidden custody below, paper fictions around it, frightened temporary owners between. He was not marketing property, but managing panic dressed up as real estate. When Bino tried to seize full control by fresh documentary fraud, Reed became a danger. Therefore Reed died. Kramer said, "All right, you've laid the story. What about Boone?" "I still don't have Boone." That was the one remaining chill in the room. Walter Boone had hovered over the case like a rubbed-out ghost who refused to stay erased. Wolfe nodded. "Mr. Boone is the older victim, though perhaps not by direct murder in the same room or by the same hand. He discovered the title defect years earlier and seems to have entered the house's hidden history too deeply. His name was removed from records. His traces were burned, but not perfectly. I believe he either died in connection with Mercer Street or was driven into permanent disappearance by those who controlled it. Mr. Bino's papers may yet clarify that. For present purposes, Boone matters, because his knowledge survived in hidden custody notes, and in the panic of those who later learned what he had learned first." Kramer grunted. "That'll do for now. It would have done for most men. It did not quite do for Wolfe." He leaned back, closed his eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them and fixed Milton Crane. "One more matter. The current agent's too-ready hospitality. Mr. Crane, when Archie Goodwin first visited Mercer Street under an assumed identity, you admitted him at once. Why?" Crane's throat moved. "Because Reed had said there might be an inquiry from a buyer." "A real buyer?" "I did not know." "Did you expect Reed?" "No." "Did you expect Bino?" Crane hesitated. "That was the wrong thing to do in Wolfe's office." "Yes," Wolfe said softly. "You expected Bino or one of Bino's men. You were on watch not for a customer, but for a retrieval. After Reed's death, everyone connected with Mercer Street feared that some paper, some custody note, or some surviving evidence of Boone's discovery remained hidden in the house. You stood ready to admit the right kind of visitor." Crane said nothing. Wolfe nodded. "Thank you." Kramer rose halfway from his chair. "If he knew that, I want him." "You already have him morally," I said. "The legal part is just transportation." Pearlie made a sound that might have been a laugh strangled in infancy. Ruth Keller suddenly spoke, her voice thin but determined. "Mr. Wolfe, am I ruined?" That changed the room again, because fear with a clear question on it is harder to ignore than fear making a general atmosphere. Wolfe regarded her. "No, embarrassed perhaps. Examined, certainly. But your role appears nominal and foolish rather than central, Mr. Kramer shrugged. "If that holds up, she's a witness." She shut her eyes briefly. Clara Donne reached across and touched her hand, not because they knew each other, but because frightened women in rooms full of men with papers sometimes recognize a species. Wolfe looked almost annoyed by the sentiment, which is one of his ways of tolerating it. He said, "The essential point, for all of you, is this. Mercer Street was never merely an old house with a hidden room. It was a false title sustained by selective architecture, staged respectability, and human timidity. Jasper Reed died in the visible part, because visibility was part of the plan. The true crime began long before, when a defective conveyance was converted into profit, and a man named Walter Boone was rubbed out of the narrative because he knew it. He turned then to me. Archie, the final sequence. I had it ready. I read from my notes. Old defective transfer. A pertinent rear rights omitted from later papers. Boone notices, investigates, occupies or uses the house, receives keys, then disappears from records and likely from life. Tullen later Bino preserve practical control instead of lawful title. Reed discovers the same truth years later. He restores and stages the house in fragments through separate owners and isolated repairs. He uses Vesey for old materials, Crane for marketing and access, Leonard Donn for the appearance and sound of cultured occupancy, and frightened nominal owners like Ruth Keller to keep the paper moving. He sells private use and controlled belief to clients while profiting from the panic that clear title or public scrutiny would cause. Reed then learns Bino intends a fresh fraud to correct the original defect without exposing the old one. Reed threatens him. Reed is poisoned in the dining room. The concealed chambers and stairs remain the actual heart of the enterprise. When I finished, no one objected. That is one of the pleasures of having a sequence right. Even guilt sometimes sits still for it. Kramer stood up fully this time. That's enough for me. Wolfe lifted a finger. One final caution. Do not let the house itself seduce you. Old walls are innocent except of endurance. Men made Mercer Street useful for deceit because it offered concealment and dignity in equal measure. The dining room looked respectable. The passages looked obsolete. The papers looked formal. Those are merely costumes. Kramer nodded once. I know. Do you? Then remember that if Bino claims he only maintained inherited confusion, he lies. Confusion preserved for profit ceases to be confusion. It becomes system. Kramer gave him a hard look. You trying to improve the police department? No, only your vocabulary. That ended it as neatly as Wolfe could wish in public. Kramer took Crane and Vesey with him for further uses. Pearlie followed. Ruth Keller remained seated until I helped her up. She thanked me as if gratitude were another paper she had signed without reading. Clara and Leonard Donn left together, not reconciled exactly, but at least under the same weather. Saul slipped out with his usual silence, heading, I assumed, toward whatever file or witness Walter Boone might still command from the dead. When the door had closed on the last of them, the office relaxed by degrees. Not at once. Rooms that have held too much truth need a minute to remember they are only rooms. I sat down and looked at Wolfe. Satisfied? Moderately. That's almost indecent enthusiasm from you. He ignored it. There remains Boone. Always Boone. Yes. I stretched my legs and reached for cigarettes. Funny thing. Reed thought the house was his invention. Bino thought the papers were his. Boone probably thought discovery entitled him to decency. And all along the place was just sitting there, while generations of crooks tried to improve it. Wolfe closed his eyes. Houses are patient. That is one of their worst qualities. Will you do the office gathering, after the office gathering, and explain it all again for your own pleasure? He opened one eye. I have just done so. Not enough velvet in it. There was sufficient. I lit the cigarette and let the first pull settle me. Outside, the city had gone fully dark. Somewhere downtown, Mercer Street stood with its face like a closed fist, keeping its brick council a little longer while the law tugged at the threads men had run through it. The dining room was only the stage. I said, yes, and the real audience sat behind the walls. Wolfe nodded. For years, that was true enough to leave alone. The rest, what became of Boone in the end, and what old New York habit had first made Mercer Street worth preserving as a fraud, would come soon enough. Cases like that do not stop cleanly. They fade out of one room and into another. But by then the center had yielded. The visible death had been put back where it belonged, as the final act of an older crime. And when Nero Wolfe has done that, a house can go back to being only brick, timber, and a caution to optimists. Chapter 8. The room built not for living. When Nero Wolfe chooses to end a case in his office, he does not do it because the police require education or because the guilty deserve ceremony. He does it because truth, to satisfy him, must be arranged in the proper room and under the proper light, with every chair occupied by the correct degree of fear. I had seen that happen often enough to know the signs. On the evening Wolfe chose to finish Mercer Street. The yellow lamp on his desk made the office look warmer than it felt. The red leather chair had been moved half an inch to suit his eye, and Fritz had been instructed to admit latecomers with less courtesy than usual. That meant Wolfe was beyond hospitality and deep in geometry. The weather had turned colder. 35th Street sent up the sounds of cabs, brakes, and distant horns, through windows shut tight against them, and from above there drifted the faint damp breath of the orchids, as if the house itself were listening. Wolfe sat behind his desk like a carved idol who had accepted beer as an article of worship. I was at my desk with the notes. Inspector Crayframmer occupied the red leather chair with the expression of a man who had agreed to a final explanation only because every other road led through more paper. Saul Panzer stood near the shelves. Pearlie Stebbins had the wall. Clara and Leonard Donn sat together, not comfortably, but at least on speaking terms with gravity. Ruth Keller was there too, pale and tight-handed, but resolute enough to hear her own foolishness named. Edwin Vesey came because Wolfe had sent for him in words that implied refusal would be interpreted as a confession. And Milton Crane came because he had no safe place left to avoid. That left Albert Bino absent and useful. He was already under arrest and had spent the last 48 hours doing what lawyers do when the machinery they trusted begins to grind the wrong way. He denied murder, admitted nothing, and relied on his profession to confuse the difference between old fraud and recent homicide. Wolfe had let him stew. That was not mercy. It was preparation. Milton Crane entered last. He was dressed correctly, as always, but the correctness had gone brittle. Men like Crane depend so much on surface that once surface fails them, they seem to become underdressed inside their own skin. He sat where I indicated, glanced once toward the door, as if measuring distance, and then fixed his eyes on Wolfe with the brave look of a coward who has found that cowardice no longer saves effort. Wolfe waited until Fritz had placed coffee on a side table and withdrawn. Then he folded his hands over the curve of his waistcoat and began in the tone he used when the facts had stopped entertaining him and started obeying. "We are here," he said, "because the Mercer Street house has finally ceased pretending to be a real estate matter. It was never one. It was a mechanism. For years men used it as if title, occupancy, architecture, and secrecy could be braided into one profitable lie. They nearly succeeded. The house changed owners 4 times in 2 years, and yet served only one master, fear. No one moved. Even Kramer merely grunted and let him go on. The visible rooms of Mercer Street were a performance. The dining room where Jasper Reed died was part of that performance. It looked empty, respectable, and final. Such rooms encourage false conclusions. But the real center of the matter was never the dining room, nor even the cellar passage. It was the room behind the hidden stair on the 2nd floor, the room built not for living. He turned his eyes to Leonard Donn. Mr. Donn led us to it, though belatedly, and with inadequate courage. Mr. Goodwin verified it. A narrow fitted panel in the rear room, fresh scratches by the baseboard, a hollow wall, a hidden staircase descending between plaster and inner brick, and at the bottom a cramped chamber with no window, no hearth, and no decent human purpose. Leonard swallowed. Clara looked down at her hands. Wolfe continued. One may build a hidden room for any number of innocent reasons. Servants' access, storage, old utility work. Smuggling, perhaps, if one has a generous idea of innocence. This room was not such a place. It lacked all provisions for ordinary storage and all convenience for habitation. It was shaped for the keeping of ruin. Kramer shifted. Meaning what? Meaning papers so dangerous they could not safely exist in daylight. Meaning so ugly they could not safely be spoken. It first served to conceal forged documents, custody notes, and records, by which the old defect in Mercer Street's title was both preserved and exploited. Later, it served worse purposes because a room designed for hidden wickedness is readily adapted. Walter Boone learned too much and was held there. Jasper Reed later learned enough of its history to use it as leverage against the very men who once depended on it. That landed hard. Ruth Keller gave a little gasp. Vesey shut his eyes. Crane sat still, but too still. Kramer said, "Held there, you can prove that?" Wolfe turned slightly toward him. "Proof in murder is a ladder, Mr. Kramer, not a thunderbolt. We have Boone's erased tenancy, his known inquiry into the defective conveyance, the burned scraps naming him, the custody references from Bino's office, the room itself, and one more fact, Mr. Goodwin obtained yesterday from a retired delivery clerk who worked the neighborhood 12 years ago." Archie, that was my cue. I opened the notebook. The clerk was with an old coal and provisions outfit that serviced Mercer Street briefly in Boone's period. He remembered bringing groceries to the house in late winter more than once, after Boone had stopped answering the door himself. A different man let him in, tall and smooth-faced, likely Tull's assistant, or someone under Bino's instruction. The clerk heard knocking from inside the walls or below stairs, and joked about rats. The man told him rats were better company than lawyers. Pearlie let out a low sound. Kramer turned his head. "You didn't tell me that before." "I just got it," I said. "You were busy arresting the wrong man for murder." Kramer glared at me, then at Wolfe. "Go ahead." Wolfe inclined his head as if correcting a child's arithmetic. "Albert Bino is guilty of old fraud and very likely of Boone's disappearance or the concealment of it. But he did not kill Jasper Reed. That broke the room open." Vesey jerked upright. Ruth Keller stared. Leonard looked first relieved and then sickened, which was sensible. Crane did not move, not 1 inch. That was enough to make him conspicuous. Kramer's voice came out flat. "You told me Bino poisoned Reed. I told you it was probable on the evidence then available. I have since improved the evidence. You should be pleased. It happens so rarely." "Who?" Wolfe's gaze moved and settled on Milton Crane. "Mr. Crane killed Reed." For a second there was only the faint hiss from the radiator and the far muffled hum of the city outside. Crane laughed once. It was a dry, amazed little noise, the kind men make when the bridge has gone and they still think sound might help. "That is absurd." "No," Wolfe said. "It is merely inconvenient." Crane found some anger, because cowards often do when logic has nearly finished with them. "I was a broker, an agent. I did not even handle the old papers." "Precise," Wolfe said. "You handled faces, entrances, timings, and atmospheres. You understood the house as theater better than any of them. Reed trusted you because you were useful, and because men who sell rooms are expected to have no appetite for legal subtleties. That made you ideal." I leaned back and watched him. Wolfe had him now, but he was going to enjoy the exact method of removal, the way one enjoys taking apart a cheap clock that has offended accuracy. Wolfe went on. "Let us restore the sequence correctly. Years earlier, a defective conveyance leaves Mercer Street in a state of profitable ambiguity. Walter Boone, from a title office, discovers the flaw and traces its practical meaning to the house itself, to hidden rights and hidden custody. He is neutralized, omitted, and either dies there or is removed from it after being kept in the room behind the stair. Men associated with Maurice Tull and later Albert Bino preserve the old fraud by controlling access and paper. Then Jasper Reed enters. Reed is livelier than they are, less prudent, and far more commercial. He learns enough of Boone's discovery to understand Mercer Street's real value. Not value as property, value as panic." He lifted one finger. "Reed then modernizes the enterprise. He arranges false domestic appearances, rotating shell owners, isolated structural repairs, and selective old furnishings. He uses Leonard Donne and the piano to humanize the house and to conceal sound. He draws men like Vesey and Crane into service. He markets privacy, continuity, and old New York atmosphere to clients willing to pay for secrecy that looked inherited. At the same time, he manages the fear of those already compromised by the title history. If the old defect came into court, many respectable people would become less respectable. Reed sold silence. Clara Donne closed her eyes. Leonard stared at the carpet. Wolfe looked toward Crane. The trouble came when Reed grew greedy, or perhaps merely bored. He discovered that Bino and others remained terrified of the old hidden record. Reed also realized that you, Mr. Crane, had become nearly as dependent as Bino. Your name touched viewings, temporary owners, and side arrangements. Exposure would not merely inconvenience you, it would ruin you. Crane's lips moved. That proves nothing. Not alone. But you made the fatal error of moving like the keeper of a stage after the principal actor had died. Wolfe nodded to me again, I said. When I first visited Mercer Street posing as Kenneth Dale, Crane opened the door too fast. Not like a salesman hoping for a buyer. Like a watcher waiting for someone expected. At the time we thought maybe Bino. Later, after Reed's death, Crane still hovered around the place. He was not guarding market value. He was guarding a script, Wolfe said. Exactly. And there is more. Reed was poisoned by cyanide in whiskey. That required opportunity, confidence, and some knowledge of Reed's habits. Bino could perhaps have managed it, but Bino hated fieldwork. He preferred paper to rooms. Crane, on the other hand, moved easily through Mercer Street, handled prospective visits, knew where glasses were kept, and knew how to preserve an appearance. The dining room looked empty because someone with theatrical sense wanted it so. Kramer grunted. Still thin. Wolfe nodded. Then let us thicken it. First, the locksmith receipt found on Reed. We traced the locksmith again. The man remembered making a duplicate not for the front door, but for an internal panel lock, small and old. After being told the owner had misplaced a service key, he identified Mr. Crane from photographs this afternoon. That did it to Crane's face. Not enough for collapse, enough for age. You had the duplicate because Reed no longer trusted you entirely, Wolfe said. He had begun moving papers and small objects into the upper stair room beyond your reach. But you obtained access. Second, the brass key Mr. Goodwin recovered from the rusted cash box. It opens a shallow compartment in the back of the second-floor wardrobe, one of your decorative additions to the apparent occupancy. Inside we found, this morning, a memorandum in Reed's hand and a bank envelope with your initials. Kramer half rose. Why wasn't I told? Because I wished first to hear what lies, Mr. Crane selected unaided. Also because Mr. Goodwin and Saul Panzer have worked very hard and deserve occasional pleasure. Crane said too fast. I want to see that memorandum. You shall not, Wolfe said. It records Reed's intent to raise the price of silence by demanding new payments from you as well as Bino. He had decided that if he were cut out of a larger settlement, he would put Mercer Street into court through counsel of his own. Your initials appear on the envelope because you had already paid him once. Crane looked at no one, which was as good as an admission in that room. Wolfe's voice stayed calm and heavy. Third, Reed arranged to meet someone in the house on the night he died. He wore no caution and had his hat off. That someone was not Bino. Bino's manner made Reed wary. It was you. You had often met there, often discussed nominal owners, room arrangements, and clients. You could pour him a drink without alarm. And when Reed said he meant to raise the price again and bring the buried history of Mercer Street into court, if refused, you understood two things at once. First, Bino would destroy anyone near the scheme to save himself. Second, if court came, you had no paper shield at all. You were the visible broker, the smooth, public face. Fear chose its own weapon. Crane found enough breath to say, "You are guessing." "No," Wolfe said. "I am concluding." The poison was administered in a room chosen for display by a man who understood display. The body was laid where the house looked most empty and respectable, the windows painted shut from within, the lamping, the careful silence. That is not Bino's imagination. It is yours. Bino made fraudulent instruments. You made scenes. That was very good, and the room knew it. Vesey stared openly at Crane now. Ruth Keller had one gloved hand over her mouth. Clara Don looked at Leonard, because in houses of corruption siblings always seem to search one another for spare innocence. Kramer said, "You said there was more." "Yes, Mr. Crane's telephone records." "Archie." I opened the next page. On the afternoon before Reed died, Crane called Ruth Keller twice, and then a payphone near Reed's office. After that, he called a supplier he had used for staging Mercer Street interiors. Nothing important there except timing. Then, after Reed's death, before the police released much to the papers, Crane telephoned a storage dealer and asked whether the second key set had ever been invoiced separately. The dealer remembered because Crane was agitated, and because nobody normal asks about second key sets at breakfast after a murder. Crane snapped. "That proves concern. It proves possession," Wolfe said, "and possession under fear. Reed's recent demands had turned you from accomplice into prey." He leaned back. "Finally, Mr. Leonard Don's overheard quarrel has been slightly misunderstood. Reed and another man argued about Boone never signing the old paper. We assumed that man was Bino. It was not, it was you. Bino had given you enough of the old story to frighten you, but not enough to protect you. Reed taunted you with the defect because it meant no later owner, no later broker, no later nominee had safe ground. You replied, in effect, that if Boone never signed, the gap could be patched. That is the language of a man repeating legal nonsense recently fed him, not of a lawyer composing it." "Leonard." Leonard lifted his head slowly. "Yes, I did not see who was in the room." The voice was smooth, younger, less dry than Bino's. At the time I was afraid, and not listening carefully. Later I told myself it was Bino, because that made more sense. But now, hearing Crane, I think it was him." Crane said nothing. He had now entered that stage of ruin where denial becomes labor, and labor has ceased to pay. Wolfe finished the structure cleanly. Walter Boone found the hidden truth first and paid for it. Jasper Reed found it later and sold it. But he sold too much. He threatened to raise the price of silence again, and to drag Mercer Street into open litigation if crossed. Mr. Crane, who had lived for years by making rooms look plausible and papers look distant, saw his own destruction approaching. He killed Reed, not because he was the strongest among them, but because he was the nearest, the most frightened, and the most practiced in arranging appearances. For perhaps 5 seconds there was only quiet. Then Crane smiled. It was one of the ugliest smiles I have ever seen because it did not aim at charm anymore. It aimed at relief. "You make it sound grand," he said. "Fear stages, ruin." It was smaller than that. Reed was impossible. He wanted money from everyone. He talked as if he owned the house, the papers, the dead, everything. He said he could make me crawl into court and explain every woman I ever put on a title sheet and every key I ever carried. He laughed. He was drinking. He wanted more. He always wanted more. Kramer was already on his feet. Crane went on, "Perhaps because once self-pity starts in a man like him, it needs witnesses as badly as innocence does." I brought the whiskey. We had used that before. He said if I didn't come through, he'd put the whole Mercer Street history into the hands of some lawyer uptown who liked scandal. I asked what he really had. He said enough, he said. Boone would walk into the room with him if he chose. He was laughing when he drank. Ruth Keller made a small sound like a broken hinge. Vesey muttered something about God and was ignored by everyone, including possibly God. Crane looked directly at Wolfe now. "I didn't mean to touch the body, but once he dropped there, the room looked right. Empty, respectable, finished. Better than the hidden places, better than the wall and that foul little stair. So I put him where the house already knew how to lie. That was confession enough for any police department with remaining ink." Kramer stepped in. "Milton Crane, you're under arrest for the murder of Jasper Reed." Crane looked almost grateful. Men who have lived too long under fear sometimes are, once the shape of it changes. Pearlie moved to assist. Crane did not resist. He only turned once toward the room, not toward any one person, but toward the assembled wreckage of Mercer Street and his own bad taste in survival. After they had taken him out and the front door had shut, the office seemed larger. Not clean, not yet, but larger. Kramer remained standing a moment. Bino still gets the paper charges. And more if Walter Boone can be fully restored to history, Wolfe said. Kramer nodded. You changed the killer on me. I improved him. Kramer gave that the look it deserved, which was a hostile one, but he was too practical to quarrel with a solved murder. All right. Boone? Wolfe took a breath. Boone almost certainly died, because the room behind the stair had already been built to keep ruin. He was held there after learning too much of the forged paper and hidden custody. Whether he was killed there or later moved remains to be found. But his importance is finished. He was the first man who recognized Mercer Street not as a house, but as a concealed legal trap. Reed inherited Boone's secret and sold it. Crane killed Reed because Reed threatened to turn concealed history into public record. That is the line. Kramer grunted. Good enough for tonight, he went, taking Pearlie with him. Saul slipped out after a nod to Wolfe that contained, for Saul, a fair amount of satisfaction. Vesey left as though expecting the corridor to accuse him. Ruth Keller thanked no one and everyone with one frightened look and followed Fritz to the hall. Clara took Leonard's arm, and they went together. That left only Wolfe and me in the office, with the lamp on the desk, the old furniture steady around us, and the city outside being itself. I lit a cigarette. The room built not for living. Yes, good line. It is accurate, I exhaled. Funny thing. 4 sales in 2 years. Shell owners, false repairs, painted shut windows, a piano, duplicate keys, forged papers, blackmail, 1 hidden stair, 1 hidden chamber, and in the end the master of the house turns out not to be Bino, Reed, or Crane. No, fear. Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Naturally, ownership is often sentimental nonsense. Use is more revealing. The house changed owners 4 times, but served only one master all along. Fear arranged the rooms. Fear moved the paper. Fear kept Boone silent. Fear enriched Reed. Fear poisoned him, and fear sat in every chair tonight. I looked around the office then. The shelves, the lamp, the red leather chair, the old brownstone holding us all in its disciplined comfort. Our house was full of habits too, but none of them needed hidden stairs or forged deeds to keep their dignity. And Mercer Street now? I asked. The law will paw it, survey it, argue over it, and eventually return it to some approximate honesty. That sounds painful. Honesty usually is, I grinned, and satisfying. For other people, perhaps. For me, it is merely necessary. Fritz came in to ask about beer. Wolfe said yes, in the tone of a man consenting to a minor theorem. When Fritz had gone, I looked once more toward the dark window, beyond which downtown lay somewhere under the same sky, and Mercer Street along with it, a narrow old house with a face like a closed fist, stern and watchful, outliving one more set of human sins. The startup was interesting, I said. Wolfe frowned. What startup? The beginning. Empty house, dead broker, false ownership. It had style, he snorted. Archie, murder is never style. At best, it is arrangement. From you that is practically poetry. It is dismissal. Fritz brought the beer. Wolfe took his glass, raised it a fraction, and settled back into his chair while I sat at my desk and began the final notes. The matter was over then, as much as such matters ever are. The room behind the stair had been named for what it was. Walter Boone had been dragged back from erasure. Jasper Reed had been properly understood, not as a property man, but as a broker in dread. Milton Crane had been given to the consequences he had tried to decorate out of existence. And Nero Wolfe, in his dry, heavy voice, had reduced an old haunted fraud to its governing principle. The house had changed hands 4 times. It had served only one master all along, fear.